MX or mixed wheel sizes is where you've got business up front and party in the back, and they're becoming more and more popular. But why would you run different size wheels on your bike? Will it be faster? Will it mess up my geometry? Let's find out if the hype matches reality. We're going to try and sort fact from fiction and explain everything that you need to know about running a mixed wheel size setup on your bike, if it's even possible. But before we dive into the tech, I've got a favour to ask, and that's if you can like and subscribe to the channel and to this video. It really helps us make really good content. Thank you. Mixed wheel size is new and exciting. Well, it might be exciting, but it's not new. Cannondale, since the 80s, ran mixed wheel size bikes. One of their classics, the Beast of the East, ran a 24-inch rear wheel and a 26-inch front. Specialised in the 2000s, had a model called the Big Hit, a really long travel freeride bike that had a 24-inch back wheel and a 26-inch front wheel. You can see there's a bit of a theme here. I mean, some say that Specialised was modified because the head angle was a bit too steep. Another range of bikes that came out in a similar time frame was Trek's 69er range. These were 29er front wheels and 26-inch rear wheels, hence the name. And there was a whole range of them, but they didn't really, well, get any traction and take off. On the race scene, it's been a while since we've had mixed wheel sizes, and that's because there was UCI laws about running mixed wheels. But Danny Hart was probably one of the first that we saw racing it in around 2019. So, are mixed wheels any faster? We're going to do a little experiment to try and find out. We've got this propane tyre which we can change, thanks to a flip chip, to run either 29-29 or 29-650. We've got matching wheels, so we've got these Reynolds carbon wheels and we've got a matching 650B rear version as well. So same width, we're trying to minimise anything that might be different. Likewise, we're going to run the same rear tyre, same width, same carcass, same model. Obviously, it will be a different diameter because the back wheel will be different. We've got a track that's got a good variety of steep sections, rocky square edges, and, well, a really fun variety of enjoyable, engaging trails, just to see what the different ride feel is. 29-29, run one, here goes. Okay, that's 29-29er, and yeah, I mean it feels kind of fast, but in a sort of slow, controlled, slightly muted way. On the steeper sections, yeah, I did have interaction. I did have tyre buzz, and it was a bit off-putting, I've got to say. But I've got short legs, so I think if you've got longer legs, you'd probably not notice. And maybe my body position wasn't perfect. Maybe I was getting too far back. Well, maybe I wasn't centered in the bike enough. Okay, run two. Now we've got the 650B rear wheel, the mixed wheel size. Let's see how it goes. Well, that was really interesting. I didn't think, because we hadn't got much geometry change, and effectively on paper, it feels like there's not that much changed. But on the bike, on the hill, there's so much change. There's more ability for me to kind of like actually push in. I've got lots more confidence, even though it kind of felt like the ride was a lot more dynamic, a lot more poppy, for want of a better word. I guess also I noticed under braking, it felt, yeah, dynamic is the best word, but I could feel the back wheel braking a lot more. But it felt like I was still in control of it a little bit more than the 29er rear. Interesting. I guess you want to know what the times are. Well, before we find out the times, just got to do a bit of nerding. When 29ers first appeared on the scene, there was lots of arguments and, well, lots of statements from brands saying that they were faster because of, well, different things with the wheels. And one of them is impedance losses. And that's because the angle of attack of the wheel, because the different diameter, means it can roll over objects better. The other thing is that because of that different diameter, it has a different contact patch. And because of that, A, it can grip better, but also there might be less hysteresis. Now, 10, 15, 20 years on from those early 29ers, the science is there. The data proves that for cross-country riding, they are faster. So, if you're riding ultra-long endeavours over rolling terrain where you're looking for efficiency and speed and comfort, 29ers are a really good option. Hyster who? Impedance watts? Okay, yeah, these are kind of slightly weird technical terms, but they are useful to describe lots of things that are going on. Hysteresis first. Okay, this is the energy losses that happen when the tyre is rolling through its carcass. So if you think of the carcass flexing down just here, it's flexing all the time, and some of that flex is absorbing energy, and how much depends on the carcass and lots of other stuff. But the bigger wheels of 29er, because of this different contact patch, mean that they've got less losses and they roll more efficiently. Impedance losses. These are kind of complex, but 29er wheels, because of their approach angle, so it's a shallower angle, so it means that it can roll over things, means that it's less likely to have impedance losses. A good example of this is a skateboard rolling along and the size of the bump that you need, because they're a really small wheel that's going to have to lift the whole skateboard up. That lifting up, that's the impedance loss. Now with a really big wheel, those losses are just less, so a 29er wheel can roll more efficiently. Since those early 29ers arrived on the scene, where and how we're riding, what we're riding regularly, has changed radically too. From traditional cross-country to, well, new school cross-country. Riding has changed radically. We're riding really burly, really steep stuff a lot more regularly. As 29ers developed and got longer and longer travel, it meant designers were more challenged. Why? Well, when a bike's got 160 mil of travel, it means that, well, as you might imagine, the rear wheel is going to move about 160 mil. So to design that into a bike with reasonable chainstay lengths, and one that you're not going to have impacts where the rear tyre is going to interface with either the seat or the seat post, is a challenge. But it's not only the bike design of packaging stuff in a long travel format that's a challenge for 29ers. No, another challenge can be the riders. DH racers were later to adopt full 29ers, full wagon wheels. And one of the reasons is, well, it's difficult to package a really big wheel and full 200 mil travel that you get on a downhill bike. But the other reason is probably to do with tyre buzz, and not tyre buzz on the frame, no, tyre buzz on the person. Downhill races need lots of weight shift to make sure that the wheels stay on the ground and track. And on really steep terrain, you need to get your weight really far back and quite low. And those shorter stature, well, tyre buzz is a real issue and a real problem. What am I talking about? I'm talking about literally interface between my butt and this tyre. As an example, this rear tyre with the tyre on and with the wheel all set up is around 745 millimeters. My inside leg is only about 760 millimeters, so that only gives me about 15 mil of clearance, which is not a lot. And actually on the bike it'll be even less. So if you're a shorter rider and you're riding the gravity side of mountain biking, where you're into steep drops and steep descents and technical stuff where you're having to do radical weight shifts on the rear, maybe the smaller wheels will be better. Apart from greater crotch clearance, what are the other advantages or disadvantages of running a 650B or 275 rear wheel with a 29er up front? Well, there can be really radical geometry changes. Thankfully, this bike, Propane Tyee, has got a flip chip here, and it's been designed specifically to work with a 650B rear wheel or a 29er. So when I change this flip chip, it keeps the geometry more or less exactly the same, depending on which wheel and which configuration. But if your bike isn't designed for this, you could void your warranty. So you might be able to go wild with offset bushings and maybe angle sets to change the geometry and work around the changes that the different wheel size will have on the bike. It's probably not recommended unless the bike is specifically designed for it, like this one. Different diameter wheels are going to create a different footprint. So even though we've got the same tyre in the same carcass and the same width, and they measure up the same, that footprint is going to be a different shape. And that means it's going to grip and roll differently. It's also going to have a different mass as well. They're going to weigh differently, and that's because, well, the 29er is bigger, so there's more carbon, there's longer spokes, and that extra mass means that there's going to be more inertia, so it's going to take more energy, so probably more time to get up to speed. So it will ride differently, and dynamic changes, sideways movements or kind of locking up a wheel, will also feel differently because of that different weight. Purely in the lab, 29ers do roll quicker, and I'm saying that because some Swiss scientists about 10 years ago did a really detailed study for the Swiss Olympic cross-country team that proved that 29er wheels were faster. Okay, that was for cross-country racing, and that is racing uphill and downhill, not really enjoying the downhill and sort of just surviving the climb. So it will be a little bit different. On paper at least, the smaller wheels, because they've got less mass, should have less inertia, and that means accelerations should be quicker with the smaller wheels. But I think once you're rolling, those differences between the different inertia fields of the different weights of wheels, well, it doesn't really match up with the reality. Of course, if your specific trails are really stop and go, then yes, it could make a difference. But for general rolling, I'm not sure it's going to factor that much. Switching to a smaller, lighter 650B rear wheel will change the balance between the sprung mass and the unsprung mass. Should you care about this? Yeah, you should. It's quite difficult to describe, but effectively we want the forces that we want to absorb to move the suspension system and not the main frame of the bike. And balancing our sprung mass to our unsprung mass can help this. Otherwise, we're going to ask our suspension systems to do a lot. So the lighter rear wheel should help the suspension. Square edge bumps. 29ers are really good at tackling these, and that's because they've got a reduced approach angle. But suspension designers and suspension designers that can play with the rear axle path of the suspension system are really key in helping 650B bikes work almost as well as 29ers. The gearing will change. Now, I know initially this sounds bonkers because all you're doing is changing the back wheel, but by changing the back wheel, specifically the rolling out diameter, that's going to change the gear ratios. So it's going to change how far one pedal stroke will take you. It changes all of the gears as well, so it makes them all slightly lower. So it means that your spinny gear will be slightly more spinny, so hopefully be able to crawl up even steeper stuff, but it will make your big crank it out on the fire road gear a little bit less tall. So you may have to go up a chainring size to get the same ratio as you had before. Wheel stiffness. Okay, the rim is the same diameter and these carbon ones from Reynolds should feel very similar, but what will be different is the spoke length. And longer spokes will flex a little bit more. Even if we play with tension, there is going to be a different dynamic ride feel. What do we mean by that? Well, it means that the smaller wheel could be a little bit stiffer, so it might be nicer to load in turns. It might feel better to push through. Conversely, the 29er one might be more compliant and actually have less trail chatter through. On a suspension bike, that trail chatter might not make much of a difference, but there will be a subtle different flavour to both wheels. Okay, despite what you might think, whilst we could switch the rear wheel, it doesn't actually change the wheelbase, at least on this bike, and that's because we're using a flip chip, but the distance from the bottom bracket to the rear axle doesn't change. So the wheelbase isn't going to change. However, not all brands do it like this, and some brands make dedicated 275 or 650B rear ends. And on those bikes, then there's going to be some more changes to that dynamic ride feel. It's going to be a little bit shorter, so that might mean it's a little bit more poppy and a bit more playful on the trail. Conversely, it's also going to be, well, maybe a little bit less stable at speed because the overall wheelbase is going to be shorter. Like a number of brands, Reynolds allows you to buy either 29 wheel set, 275 wheel set, or a mixed wheel size in a lot of its range, which is really nice to have. Bottom bracket height versus bottom bracket drop. Okay, bottom bracket height is relatively easy. That's just the height of the bottom bracket off the ground. The BB bottom bracket, same thing. Okay, BB drop. This is where the bottom bracket will drop down, or where its situation is, between the two wheel axles. Now, on a bike like this, the bottom bracket height, when we flip the flip chip, will stay pretty much the same. So the height will be the same. But the BB drop, where that bottom bracket sits between the two axles, is going to change, and that will have some dynamic ride changes. It's probably going to make it feel like it's easier to manual. And it's not because we're shortening the back end at all, it's just we're changing the ratio of where my feet are and where the bottom bracket is to where the rear axle is, so where I'm pivoting for manuals. So yeah, it's another factor where the small changes in BB height / BB drop can make a big difference to the ride, and that's where the 650B wheel could come through with the goods. Okay, that was a lot of nerding. Thanks for sticking with us. You want to know the times. I'm sure you're keen to know. Okay, well, 29:29 setup. I'd done a couple of runs beforehand, so I had warmed up. But yeah, 1:41, so 1 minute 41 seconds, which I was pretty pleased with it. There weren't any major mistakes. I wasn't able to attack that much. And I think, yeah, the next time, for me, was very surprising. 1:38, 1 minute 38, and that was for the mixed wheel size bike. So the 650B in the back really did change the ride a lot for me. I felt like it gave me a lot more confidence. In terms of where I'm getting that confidence from, I'm not really sure. The bike feels a lot more dynamic. It was easier to lift the front up, so that helped me feel a bit more confident. I think the other thing, it was easier to manual a little bit, and again, weight the back wheel, which is kind of hard to describe, and especially as it's smaller, you'd think it'd be a bit more difficult. The other thing I found really interesting is in turns. The bike felt I could kind of set a course and change it, whereas the 29er was just set on one arc. It was really interesting, I've got to say. I was really surprised that this bike was quicker. I think the other factor was that on some of the kind of rollovers, the steeper sections, with this bike, with the mixed wheel size, I was able to commit a lot more, and I was able actually almost to sort of pre-jump into them.
So what the heck is a downcountry bike? Isn't it just a long travel cross-country bike? And isn't it all just mountain biking anyway? Well, there's some subtle differences that could make you love or hate your new ride. So stay tuned and I'm going to explain all. In the words of Canyon, downcountry bikes aren't cross-country bikes, but they sort of are. Now, downcountry was a term coined to categorize this new breed of bike that sits somewhere between cross-country and trail. It should have all the speed and efficiency of a cross-country bike, but all the confidence and capabilities of a trail bike. However, it should be lighter and more nimble than a trail bike, but also it should be more fun and versatile than an all-out racing cross-country bike. A rider wanting a pure cross-country bike for battling it out on short courses will want something light, stiff, and probably aggressive in the stance and the gait on the bike. And this is to get optimal performance for sprinting and climbing. However, this style of bike might be quite fatiguing for someone who wants to do long distances or a casual long ride out with some friends. Equally, a trail bike might be great on long distances, it might be comfortable, but also it can be quite cumbersome and maybe a bit sluggish, where it's designed to focus on descents and maybe shredding in the woods with your friends. Cross-country bikes tend to have head angles of between 68 and 70 degrees. Now, this gives you a more forward-leaning position so that you can be more efficient at pedaling, but also keep the weight and the traction on the front wheel for those steep climbs. Now, downcountry bikes tend to have a head angle of between 66 and 68 degrees. This is a lot slacker, which gives you a neutral position when you're in the saddle pedaling, but it also helps you shift your weight back for descents and have an overall more stable and confidence-inspiring ride. Downcountry bikes tend to have a slightly longer reach and a longer wheelbase. Now, a longer reach will make the bike feel more stable and confidence-inspiring at speed and on descents, but it might feel a little sluggish in tight turns. So that's why the cross-country bike favors a slightly shorter, more nimble ride. Now, this is Doddy's extra large Luxe Trail, but if it was in my size, the reach would be about 25 millimeters longer than my Exceed race bike, and the chainstays would also be 10 millimeters longer. Now, this longer chainstay will also contribute to that longer wheelbase and that more stable, confidence-inspiring feel, but also it gives better clearance in the rear triangle for wider tires. Now, me and Doddy are actually running very similar widths here with the 2.25 and a 2.35 on the back, but a downcountry bike being able to take bigger tyres with bigger volume means lower pressures and more comfort for those long journeys. Now, back in the early noughties when I started racing, it used to be that a cross-country racer would pick a hardtail and a downcountry or a marathon rider would pick a full suspension. However, most of the racers in the World Cups these days are running full suspension. And I would say most of them are on 100 mils of travel, although Nino Schurter did just win his World Championship for the 10th time on 120 mil full suspension. So I admit the waters are a little murkier these days on distinguishing between the two bikes when it comes to suspension. However, I would say that 120 to 130 still is pretty commonplace when it comes to speccing a downcountry bike. Also, you might find that you have slightly thicker stanchions on the forks, say for example a Fox 34 instead of a Fox 32, whereas an XE bike will want something skinnier and lighter for their racing rig, whereas a thicker stanchion and longer travel will give you a bit more of a plusher, confidence-inspiring ride for those long rides out in the downcountry. Whether you pick a hardtail or a full suspension bike, a cross-country race bike will really focus in on being light and stiff, which might not be that comfortable if you want a downcountry bike. Now, also downcountry bikes, because they're not focusing on that lighter weight, you can get them in aluminium as well, which might give you a bit of a saving, almost up to £1,000 in some cases, which might be more valuable to you if you're not trying to win medals. Drivetrain tends to be the same between cross-country and downcountry, although you might find on downcountry bikes there is more options for affordable drivetrains, whereas cross-country race bikes might be specced with slightly higher drivetrains. One of the biggest differences though between the bikes, I would say, is the rim widths. So cross-country race bikes like this tend to be between 20 and 30 mil in widths, and that's so they can run between 1.9 and 2.3 inch tyres. Now, the reason for that is because XE tends to focus on less materials and lighter weight, whereas the downcountry bikes tend to be around about 30 mil wide so that they can run 2.3 to 2.5 inch tyres. That will give you a wider tyre, which means bigger volume and the ability to run lower pressures, which is just more comfortable, especially over long distance rides. Cockpits on cross-country bikes tend to be pretty low. You'll often see drop stems, so a bit like mine here, which has a negative rise of 17 degrees, and that is just contributing to that forward position again. It keeps your body centered when the bike is pointing upwards, and it makes it extremely efficient for climbing. Now, unfortunately, this can be quite fatiguing over long distances, especially if you are not strong and flexible and fit enough to maintain that position. Downcountry bikes tend to have either a neutral or a slightly higher cockpit. So this one here has a +7 degree rise. Now, this keeps the body position up and back, and it will be a more comfortable position over a long distance ride, but also it'll be more confidence inspiring when you're descending. It'll also be easier to shift your weight back if you're tackling technical terrain. Also, you can see here that this is a two-piece setup with a handlebar and stem, whereas my Exceed race bike is a one-piece cockpit. So you really need to know what you want if you're buying a one-piece race bike, whereas a downcountry bike will often be specced in a stem and handlebar combo that you can change up depending on what you're tackling that weekend, or if you just want to play around with bike fit more. Now you can get double water bottle buses on cross-country race bikes, and even dropper posts as well are creeping through onto XC race bikes. I mean, the purist among you might only want one water bottle for aerodynamics and lightweightness, and they might want a rigid post to again save more weight. Here at GMBN Tech, we are often asked, isn't a gravel bike just a cross-country bike with drop handlebars? And my personal favourite, why is GMBN covering gravel anyway? Well, I'm going to go into depth about the two and the differences, covering geometry and even wheel circumferences. So stay tuned to find out for yourself. A gravel bike is basically off-road road riding, and a cross-country bike is your classic mountain biking, going up, down and through single track. But I can see where the confusion lies lately as the lines have started to blur. You can buy XC bikes with rigid forks, and you can buy gravel bikes with fat tyres and front suspension. But there are some minute differences that make them better bikes for their purist category. So let's take a closer look. It should go without saying that a gravel bike is more designed to be sat in the saddle pedaling. And while an XC bike does need to be pedaled in the saddle as well, but it also needs to be really good at single track and tackling obstacles. So the geometry numbers need to reflect a more dynamic riding position. When we look at wheelbases between the two bikes, they can be quite dramatically different. A gravel bike has quite a short wheelbase. It needs this so that it can be nimble in big slalom corners and fast fire road descending corners. A longer wheelbase will also be good for the XC bike to keep the front end down when it's climbing up steep technical terrain. Gravel bikes tend to have much steeper head angles than XC bikes. The gravel bike needs a steeper head angle so that you can balance both wheels, and you can also keep your weight over the front to control that front end and keep grip on that front wheel as you go around corners. The XC bike needs a slacker head angle as it brings you back into the center with its longer wheelbase. It also leaves you feeling behind the bike when you tackle obstacles like roots and rocks. The gravel bike, because of its steep head angle, may leave you feeling a little out of depth when you're going over rooty terrain or down steep terrain. But equally, the XC bike may feel a little sluggish if you are using that for gravel. An XC bike tends to have a much taller stack and a longer reach, and this puts the rider upright, so it's more confidence inspiring in technical terrain and more dynamic for when you're tackling single track. On a gravel bike, we tend to have a shorter reach, but a lower stack. Now this will feel like the same sort of stretch on the bike, but you'll be much lower. So this gives you a more aerodynamic position for riding fast and long distances on, say, fire roads. And it also means that you're weighting that front wheel again, as it's most important to keep grip on that front wheel. On a gravel bike, don't forget that handlebars and even hoods can add extra length to your bike. So it's not just about reach if you're looking at whether a bike fits you or not. Generally, if you don't know what you're looking for, then the manufacturer usually has a good idea of what size you need. On an XC bike, you'll usually find flat handlebars. This gives you a much stronger riding position for taking on obstacles. It also means that you can control and turn that front end if you're riding through single track and turning round trees. On the gravel bike, you tend to have drop bars, as this gives you a nice aero position. You tend to be cornering whilst you're leaning rather than turning the bars. And you also get multiple positions on the hoods and on the drops, which is great for changing up your position if you're doing long miles in the saddle. XC bikes tend to have front suspension from 80 to 120 mil. This is 100 mil, that's about average for an XC bike. Gravel bikes tend to be either no sus at all, just a rigid fork, ranging up to about 60 millimeters. So the gravel bike quite rightly bridges the gap between road and cross-country. Gravel suspension forks also differ in that they need to have shorter travel to keep you more upright. And also, if you bike pack in, it means that you don't sink too much and steepen up all the angles on your bike. If, like me, you're an adventurer, then rigid forks might be the way to go. They often come with bolt bosses, which means you can even attach your luggage or extra water to them. Both gravel and XC bikes tend to come with hydraulic disc brakes these days. Gravel will usually have 140 to 160 disc rotors, whereas XC are usually 160 to 180. Also, gravel tends to only have 2-pot or 2-piston calipers, although you can upgrade them to 4-pot if you are weighting the bike or if you're a heavier rider, if you want more stopping power. Also, I would say that 140 discs on a gravel bike is pretty good for most things. Some people will want to put 160 on the front, and some people even put a 140 on the rear and keep it smaller because they feel that it doesn't lock up the back wheel. Personally, I don't have any problem with that, but it's personal preference. The brakes obviously look very different on both bikes. The XC bike has a lever on flat bars, whereas the gravel bike needs a lever that can be operated from both the hoods and on the drops. So it's very similar to road in that it's integrated into the gear shifting mechanism. Most modern XC bikes come with a 1x12 gearing system. Now this Shimano XT that Rich has got here has a cassette of 10 to 51, which is one of the widest ranges, going from smallest, hardest gear up to a nice big easy gear, around about 510%. Now the Shimano GRX on the gravel bike here is the top range for Shimano gravel at the moment, and it's a 2x11 system, so 2 gears on the front, 11 gears at the rear. And that is obviously 22 gears in total, but there's a lot of crossover. So you don't actually get as much range as with the cross-country bike. You get about 474% on this. Now, I do expect a 2x12 to come about soon. There is a SRAM Force Axis available at the moment, which is a 2x12, and that has slightly more range than the 1x12 Shimano that we have here. But obviously that is electronic, so it means it would be much more expensive, almost twice the price. And if you're considering long distance riding and bike packing, then you're going to need to consider charging up those batteries as well. But there are some benefits to a 2x11 system if the range is suitable for you. Not only is it mechanical, but you get to dump a whole bunch of gears with just one click on the left-hand side. That means if you're going fast on fire roads and then you're met by a steep climb, you can dump a whole load of gears all at once. This is much more likely to happen on gravel riding than it is on cross-country. Cross-country riders tend to favour a 1x12 system as well, as you get a good range, but you don't get any crossover, and you can move through the gears quickly, and that's what's important on a cross-country race bike. You can get a 1x system for gravel, which is nice and simple and you don't get the crossover, but bear in mind that if it's a 1x11 system, you're not going to get the range that you do with a 2 or a 1x12. So that means if you're in the sprinty end of gravel, it might be fine, or if you're in the cruisy, climby end of gravel, that might be fine. But if you expect to be doing all of those, then you might not get the range of gears that you want. Your average road bike weighs about 11 kilos, and a gravel bike roughly around 13 kilos, as it needs to be a bit heavier to take on heavier duty terrain. And then going up to the cross country, your average bike is around 15 kilos. Granted, you can get a top spec race bike in 13 kilograms, but it will be very, very top with a high price tag. So this puts the gravel bike, even in weight, smack bang in the middle between road and XC. So if you're looking to cover distance with a lightweight bike that's simple and reasonably affordable, then the gravel bike is probably your best bet. In both gravel and XC, you'll see a lot of carbon and aluminium frames. So carbon will be typically lighter and stiffer, so it's a great choice for the racers if money's no object. Aluminium, slightly heavier, but a lot more affordable. On the gravel scene, we see a lot more steel bikes than we do in XC, as steel can be a little too heavy for XC, but on the gravel scene, it's seen as a frame that can take a bit more of a beating, and it can be fixed and re-welded if it needs to. So the steel gravel bike is a bit of a favourite amongst bike packers and long distance riders. Titanium has similar benefits to steel in that it can take a bit of a beating and it can be fixed, but it can come in a raw finish, which means it's popular amongst bike packers as you won't wear off your paint. And it's also a lot lighter than steel, but it does come with a heftier price tag to match. Most XC bikes come with 29-inch wheels these days, although you can still get them as 27.5, especially for smaller sizes. On the gravel bike, you tend to find a 700C wheel size, which is actually just a 29-inch wheel diameter, so similar to the bigger wheels on the XC. It also comes in 650B, like my bike here, which is spec'd to be for smaller riders, but also a lot of people are favouring the smaller wheels so they can put fatter tyres on there if they want more cushion and more comfort. The big difference between, say, road wheels and gravel wheels is that gravel wheels tend to be a lot wider. And over to the XC bike, they are even wider still. For a gravel bike, you can get anything from a 38C up to a 50C. And that's about 38 millimeters up to 58 millimeters. And just to confuse things, we go over to inches on mountain bikes, where it's usually 1.5 inches up to 2.5 inches. So just for reference for all you mountain bikers out there, a 700C wheel with a 38C tyre is roughly the same as a 29er wheel with a 1.5 inch tyre, because 38C is roughly 38 millimeters, which is nearly 1.5 inches. At the fatter end of gravel, you can see my bike's got 650B wheels with 44C tyres, and that's at the fatter end of gravel, but that only gives you a similar diameter to a 29er XC bike with 1-inch tyres, and that's pretty much on the skinny end of XC. So XC does go into the wider category so that it can roll over technical terrain and go through rough, rooty single track, whereas gravel is designed to be a little firmer. It doesn't need to go through technical terrain. It needs to be fast and nippy and agile. So even at the fatter end of gravel, it still might feel a bit out of its depth over rough, rooty terrain. Whereas the XC bike will shine in that kind of terrain, but it might actually feel a bit sluggish and slow if you were doing long distance gravel fire roads, say. So in conclusion, there's nothing wrong with using the XC bike to ride gravel or do a bit of bike packing. And equally, there's nothing wrong with taking a gravel bike down rooty single track, but each bike will feel more at home in its natural habitat.
Carbon versus alloy. It's the modern day title fight at the trailhead or the post-shred pint. Alloy. Tough, long lasting, but heavy. Carbon. Light, stiff, but fragile. What's the material differences between modern metal and space age carbon fibre? What makes the perfect mountain bike? The debate's got more confusing as some brands' marketing spin has kind of muddied the waters between fact and fiction. We're going to find out what the pros and cons are of both materials. Propane have engineered these two tyres with the same suspension system, very similar geometry, very similar components. There's some slight differences, but essentially the only difference between these two bikes is that one's carbon fibre and one's alloy. So we're going to find out what the difference is between these two bikes. As with many bike innovations, Mountain bike wasn't the first to use aluminium. No, there was a French brand in the 1950s called Barra who made randonneur, a bit like road touring bikes, almost like gravel bikes, back then. Now, in mountain biking, well, you often think that steel is the first material, and lots of early mountain bikes were steel, but aluminium was used even then. The incredible innovator that founded Wilderness Trail and designed loads of crazy tech, Charlie Cunningham, his first bike was fully aluminium, and this was in the late 70s. The innovation continued with Charlie Cunningham making loads more aluminium bikes. It wasn't just Charlie developing aluminium bikes either. No, Doug Bradbury, who founded Manitou, also made frames. But it didn't really get going with aluminium in mountain biking until some really big players who'd already made lots of aluminium road bikes, which is Klein and Cannondale. Once they stepped in the market, alloy went huge, and I don't just mean the tubing diameter. Aesthetically, these huge aluminium tubes were striking from the skinny steel tubes of lots of other bikes. But it wasn't just about looks. No, there was some engineering know-how, and these huge tubes made the bikes light and stiff. A combination of greater engineering know-how, material science, and advanced production techniques have all moved aluminium from a top-shelf material to the perfect material for, well, almost everything, from a downhill race bike to an entry-level hardtail. Carbon doesn't have the long legacy that steel or aluminium alloys do in the bike industry. However, you might be surprised to know about composite bikes back in the early 60s. The Bowden Spacelander was a wild composite bike, and it did look incredible. It was streamlined to perfection, but it didn't sell that well. Carbon didn't really start in mountain biking until the late 80s. Yeah, the 80s. I know, wild. 1988, we had two brands, Kestrel and Trimble, come into the market, both with full carbon frames. The Trimble was a really wild cantilever bike. The Kestrel, slightly more tame, slightly milder, still had an elevated chainstay because they were cool at the time. It was Kestrel that really pushed things on by pulling in some ex-moto engineers to help them develop a show bike, which then got turned into a production bike, a full suspension carbon bike called the Nitro. Oh, and those ex-moto engineering type nerds? Well, yeah, that's Keith Bondraker and Paul Turner, who went on to develop, well, lots of amazing tech, including some of the first production suspension forks. Carbon was slow at gaining ground, especially compared to aluminium. And that's because, well, to produce it is a bit more technically challenging. To turn a black fabric into a frame, or at least a reliable frame, takes a long time to master. But now, decades on, it's at the very cutting edge of components, and it's not all expensive either. Aluminium is hugely common. What do I mean by that? Well, it's the seventh most abundant element, metallic element, on the planet. And at the surface crust, so that's the bit that wraps around the Earth, it's the most common metallic element. We talk about aluminium, but you don't find chunks of aluminium that commonly on the ground. But what you do find quite often, well, in the right places, is bauxite. That's an ore that's very rich in aluminium. And it gets processed through, well, lots and lots of energy in an electrolysis process that's very in-depth, way over my head. But essentially, we get pure aluminium from that process. But when we're making bikes, we don't use pure aluminium. Okay, some of the very early ones in the 50s did, but they were very brittle. What we use is aluminium alloys, whereby we put in tiny molecules of extra elements that change the aluminium into these aluminium alloys. And they help hugely in strengthening the material as a final tube, but they also help in production. So smoothing the flow of the material when we're actually making it into a tube, helping it when we're welding, and helping it with heat treatment, which is something we need to do after the weld process. For an example, 6061 aluminium alloy, okay, it's 97.2% aluminium, but it's got 9 additional elements, some as low as 0.1%. So all very small differences, molecular changes, but it makes a big difference to the material output. Aluminium alloys are lightweight and they're easy to machine as well. Steel, for example, is, well, much heavier than aluminium. Okay, it's easy to machine and easy to work with, but it is density challenged. A material that's not density challenged, aka is lightweight, is titanium, often talked about as a hyper material. But titanium is very hard to work with. It's hard to machine and difficult to weld. Aluminium alloys are highly formable as well. So when you're kind of making them into the tube shape, so you can extrude them, you can hydroform them where you're using oil to press them and conform them, they really work well. They're really plastic, which I know sounds like an odd term, but it means you can get really good shapes and structures. And a lot of the goodness of the material, the grain structure and lots of the hardcore engineering, is then set in the frame in these tube shapes. And that's great for manufacturing because, okay, you can get bad welds, they're on show. You can get bad heat treatment. That's less easy to see, but not a common mistake. So lots of these properties are bedded into the frame. The high manipulation of these materials to make either frame junctions or components or tubes gives frame designers and engineers lots of freedom to put suspension components in really tight spaces and package everything up. Carbon fibre is ultra new and cutting edge. Yeah, no, that's a material myth, because carbon fibre was first used in production in the 1880s. Okay, that was in light bulbs and not in bikes, and it took a little while for the high-performance carbon fibre that we know and love now to really gain traction. It was around the late 70s when it really took off. Right, carbon fibre. Yeah, well, actually, the name's wrong. I know, it sounds odd, but it should be carbon fibre composite, because it's actually a third resin, and the development of those resins has really changed how mountain bikes can use carbon fibre. And also, we talk about carbon fibre, and you might imagine in lots of different products, and there can be. You can have short fibres where you're using really short sections of carbon fibre. Our bikes, and lots of bikes in general, use lots of long carbon fibre sheets. And I say sheets again. With the short stuff, it can be injection moulded. It's really small. But for bikes, it comes in, well, two different formats that I know. That's woven sheets, and you can get those in two formats too. You can get pre-preg, which is pre-impregnated with resin, or you can get it dry, where it needs to be brushed and painted with the resin later. Carbon fibre is a true high-performance material. It is 5 times stronger than steel. It is twice as stiff whilst being half the weight. It is really, really impressive. But how it's made is really important, because what lies beneath the paint is just as important as what it's made of. How do we go from a flat blanket to a 3D form like this in carbon fibre? Well, it's relatively complex. We need moulds, external, we need moulds on the inside to form around. And it's really important that we're laying up these materials, that we mix up the orientation, because carbon fibre is really strong under tension, but not very good in shear strength. But we can design around it by overlaying these plies. You'll hear about a ply or a layup, and that's literally where you're laying over the fabrics on top of each other. And in certain areas, you're going to have more. You're going to have different orientation. And one of the things that designers can do with this layup is change the material's property. This is where it gets a bit mind-bending, but if we go back to an aluminium tube, effectively, its strength is uniform in all directions. But with carbon fibre and this ability to tune and lay up the fabric differently, it means that we can get different properties in different directions, which is really quite radical. We've got our materials laid up, but how do they bond? Well, we talked about pre-preg before, that's one method, and the other method is injecting resin. But either way, we need an even spread because we want a composite. We don't want really resin-rich areas, and we don't want dry fibres. So how the material is laid up and how the resin is flowed through, sometimes complex shapes aren't very good for flowing, all has to be engineered in. The process of making the frame in terms of laying up the fabric is as simple as one titanium builder once said as folding an envelope. It's really simple, but making sure it's designed correctly and making sure that all these layers and the resin are consistent throughout the structure are key, and that is quite difficult to design. One of the elements that we haven't discussed in this material arms race is cost. It's a big one. So we looked at material costs just as a raw per kilo. Aluminium runs from around $2, possibly up to $6. What about carbon fibre? It's a lot more expensive. This is just per kilo, remember, not finished bikes, but per kilo of the material. And it starts at around $30 per kilo. And for the aerospace grade, the really good stuff, it's around $85. It gets expensive. The material costs do vary wildly, but what about the actual manufacturing of them? What about the factories? Sadly, I don't own a factory, but we can kind of imagineer our way into one and think about how these frames are made and the impact of the costs. We'll start with alloy, and depending on how we're going to make those tubes, whether we're going to draw them, that's expensive in itself, or we're going to use a hydroforming machine to make these really complex shapes. Those machines are really expensive. They're using thousands of pounds of pressure to squish aluminium with oil into shape. Those machines don't come cheap. And if you think about the size of a tube, you've got to completely envelop it with oil to press it into the shape. They're expensive. Okay, the next stage of manufacture, just briefly, is going to be probably welding. And the complex shapes and the variety of sizes that we have in mountain bikes means that it might be automated at maybe swing arm or some sub-assemblies, but lots of it might be done by hand. And to get a skilled welder, that's quite expensive. I guess the QC process of a welded frame is a little bit easier because, well, I mean, first you can see if a weld looks a bit bad. That's a good visual check. I mean, you can then see if it's straight. You can also cold set frames, which sounds a bit brutal, but is a really good way of making sure a frame is straight and true. With carbon fibre, the process is quite different. Why? Because, well, the carbon fibre frames, as we've talked about these plies being laid up by hand, it's a really hands-on task. You've got to lay the materials in an exact order. So you've got to be really patient and really accurate with how you lay these up. You've also got to have a really strict process to make sure that the layup is exactly right. In the process, you've also got to have really big, expensive metal moulds. That's sort of the outside of the press, if you like. On the inside, you've then either got to have special removable inserts, which you can mould around. How you remove them later is a wonderful puzzle. Or you've got moulds that stay inside your frame. Again, that's another cost. I guess the other thing with all of these handmade things, especially with carbon, is because it's so hands-on, is you've got to have a little bit more QC than you can with aluminium. And also, unlike aluminium or other metal bikes, you can't cold set it. You can't just sort of wang it back into shape. So you've got to be precise from the off. We talked about material costs, but we didn't talk about bike pricing. And obviously, brand to brand, they do vary a lot. But with this propane Tyre aluminium, at least the base model is £2,999, which is cracking value. Now, the carbon version in a similar spec costs you £3,599. So there's £700 difference. Now, we've weighed similar carbon bike and a similar aluminium bike. The specs are slightly different in terms of we've got different wheels, but they're both carbon. They're both quite nice wheel sets, so they'll be around the same. And it's about 1,500 grams, so 1.5 kilos between the two. 1.5 kilos doesn't sound like a lot. And it's interesting, on the climbs, you can notice it. There's definitely a difference in that weight because we carry around an extra 1.5 kilos, so it does make a difference. On the descents, I've got to say, I didn't feel that much of a difference. But if you climb lots, there's definitely a difference. Trek were one of the first brands to do a really detailed sustainability report, and they reported that their carbon fibre frames produced 3 times as much carbon, so 3 times as much CO2. And that's from manufacturing the carbon, that's manufacturing the bike, that's shipping it to your dealer. All of those took 3 times as much compared to that alloy bikes. It's quite a lot, it's quite a big impact. Alloy, still energy intensive to produce, however, it's really easy to recycle. Coke cans are made out of it. And whilst I've heard lots of big brands talk about how their carbon is going to be recyclable, and there's been a few brands that use recyclable carbon, the mainstream, it is really quite hard to recycle a carbon frame. Thankfully, repairing a carbon frame, depending on where the impact has been, is quite easy. You need specialist tools. You need to take it to a specialist where they can use an ultrasound tool to see where the damage goes through to. But carbon is repairable. What's it like living with a carbon fibre or aluminium alloy bike? Well, really easy. They ride really nicely, and both of them are corrosion resistant. Now, how they handle impact, knocks and general life is slightly different. We'll start with carbon fibre. Carbon fibre, as we've mentioned, is a laminate structure, so you've got all these layers sticking together, and it makes really, really strong bikes. So in riding, and when the kind of wheels are on the ground and you're hitting terrain, it's going to be super strong. It's been designed to handle those kind of impacts. Where sometimes bikes especially carbon fibre ones, can be vulnerable to impact is maybe kind of rock strikes potentially, or if you've got kind of, I don't know, like a fence, or the bike falls over onto a rock or immovable object. And that's where the bike hasn't necessarily been designed for those impacts. And because we've got these laminate layers, what can often happen is you're like, the bike's fine, there's no problem. When actually inside the frame, you have these small delaminations, and over time, those can propagate and get bigger, and there'll be a weakness in the frame. So with a carbon fibre bike, when you're riding, it's great, but just be really careful. In certain angles, they can be slightly more fragile, and it's harder to tell if they've had one of these knocks. If you're ever worried, talk to your manufacturer or go to a repair centre. Often they have ultrasound to check if there's any of these delaminations. With aluminium alloy and dents, depending on where you dent your frame, potentially maybe a down tube from a rock strike or a top tube from something falling on it or the bike falling over onto something, well, sometimes they can write off frames. Other times you can just leave the dent, monitoring it, checking it, making sure that no cracks appear around it, and just checking that it doesn't propagate through the frame. Obviously, depending on where the dent is and how thin the wall thickness is, and if it pierces the tube, well, yeah, that's a write-off, but checking with your manufacturer is key. Welds are sort of more of a weak point on an aluminium frame. There's lots of high stress in manufacturing, so lots of heat, and the heat treatment does try and dissipate some of these impacts, but it's still a point of weakness. The weld effectively is really strong, the tube it's attached to is less strong. With both frames, obviously, it's key to try and avoid any of these extraneous impacts. So yeah, try not to drop your bike onto anything sharp, try not to crash it as much as you might do, because all of those dents on an aluminium frame and all of those kind of little dings that you might not notice on a carbon frame, they do add up. So yeah, if you want to keep your bike for ages, riding it slightly gentlier and not crashing it lots is going to help a lot. Well, I do know I'm not a World Cup racer. I'm an ex-World Cup mechanic, if I haven't bored you with that already. So of course I can tell the difference between different materials in bikes. No. I mean, I might be able to tell a subtle bit of frame stiffness difference, but in terms of being able to blind test and tell the difference between a carbon frame and an aluminium frame, no, I'm not that sensitive. And also, there's too many things in the way. So, okay, we've got wheels, we've got tyres, and there's subtle differences to rim dimensions, to, unfortunately, tyre size, 2.4 to 2.6, it's very subtle. So I might be able to feel a subtle difference between the two frames, but can I say outright, oh, this is carbon, oh, that's alloy? With these two bikes, no. With other bikes, yes, it is possible. And that's not to be detrimental about these propane bikes. It's more actually a compliment that the alloy bike feels very similar to the carbon and vice versa. What you can do with carbon, which to a degree you can't do with aluminium, is change that ride profile. And what do I mean by that? Well, tubes are really important for connecting all these loading points. And with carbon, as we've briefly touched on, you can design the tube to flex in different ways. And that means that the bike can ride dynamically very differently. Very early carbon bikes, they kind of over-engineer things. I guess people were worried about this new material, so they went really heavy on carbon, and we had really thick wall thicknesses and really, really strong frames. GT back in the day had an almost unbreakable downhill bike made of carbon. What does this all mean? Well, newer bikes, newer carbon bikes specifically, they're tuning the ride. They're getting lighter, they're getting smoother, and the ride qualities are really improved. But just be mindful that if you've got suspension and you've got really big tyres, a lot of those subtleties might just be tuned out. Back to the title fight, which is the winner? Well, I mean, in conclusion, I guess we've found out that the aluminium bike is, well, a little bit more mass challenged, shall we say. A little bit better value. The carbon bike is less density or mass challenged and a little bit more expensive. How do they ride and what the differences are? Well, it's really subtle. And I think a really good example of this is actually quite a lot of brands have carbon front triangles and then aluminium back ends. So if one was far superior to the other, I feel like it would just be all carbon.
We're often asked about the different styles of mountain bike and what makes them categorised as such. Now, recently we've made videos on downhill and cross-country bikes. Both of those are in the description underneath. But in today's video, we're going to compare two of the most commonly confused bikes, trail bikes and enduro bikes. The trail bike starts where the cross-country bike leaves off. Now, as we know, cross-country bikes these days can top out with around 120 millimeters of travel. Trail bikes start at about that point, so 125 millimeters or so, up to about 150. Now, the whole thing with a trail bike is it's designed to be lightweight but durable and confidence inspiring. As a result, you can spec these style bikes out for a variety of different style riding. They have slightly more relaxed geometry than a cross-country bike, so that's going to give you a bit more confidence, and a slightly heavier frame set on these enables them to tackle a lot harder terrain. As a result, you could spec one of these out to be a heavy-duty cross-country bike or a lightweight version of an enduro style bike, so the category is quite broad in what you can do with them. The all-mountain bike, however, different kettle of fish altogether, so at a glance, yeah, it can look similar. Now, these are commonly referred to as enduro bikes thanks to the popularity of enduro racing. A slightly more apt name, I think, would be all-mountain, given what you can do on these bikes. They tend to have steeper seat angles, even more relaxed head angles on them, stronger componentry on the bikes, which of course weighs a bit more, and they have suspension travel anything from 150 up to 180 millimeters. Okay, so let's look at the frame designs on the bikes and just see what is exactly going on here. Now, the trail bike, unlike the cross-country bike, is going to be a little bit heavier, but still lighter than the enduro bike. The whole point of these is to be a more durable version of a lightweight bike to ride all day on a multitude of terrain. Whereas the enduro bike, really the focus is being strong and delivering geometry on the bike that's going to handle the roughest of terrain. Weight of the bikes varies massively as well. You can have a trail bike anything from 11 to around 14 kilograms, whereas an enduro bike, you can expect it to be 13, even up to 17 kilograms, depending on the size of the bike and the componentry that's spec'd on there, depending on what the rider needs. They're a very different kettle of fish from the modern trail bike. In both enduro bikes and trail bikes, you can expect to see options in both aluminium and carbon fibre. And it's unfair to say that either of them are better, because of the fact you can get excellent bikes in aluminium and excellent bikes in carbon. You have to choose what suits your purposes and what suits your budget. Geometry on trail bikes is more aggressive than a cross-country bike, but it's nowhere near as aggressive as what you're going to see on the enduro bikes. We will get into geometry shortly, but you can expect to find head angles in the region of around 66.5, 66 degrees, something like that. And on enduro bikes, nearer 64.5, perhaps even 64, which is closer to what a downhill bike can offer. Now, suspension designs on both bikes varies immensely. You can expect to see anything from a classic single pivot bike through to 4-bar linkages with a swing link on the top tube there driving the shock, as you can see on this bike, or even a single pivot with a linkage to drive the shock like you can see on this bike here. There's very different approaches, and everyone has a slightly different formula. Now, you've got to remember though that on a trail bike, the bike is designed to be as efficient as possible. So suspension, even if it has a similar amount of travel, because you can get 150mm trail bikes and 150mm enduro bikes, the way that the suspension feels can feel completely different between the two. Now, a good example of this would be on a trail bike, you might have, for example, a lot of anti-squat built into the design, especially in the lower gears, which means when you're climbing, the bike's not going to be sagging up and down. It resists that using the anti-squat. It will have less anti-squat, however, or they can do in the higher gears, which means when you're going faster on bumpier terrain, the suspension is going to work better. Enduro bikes will definitely have elements of anti-squat, but perhaps they can have less, because really it's about the quality of suspension travel that's more important on the enduro bike. The thing with anti-squat is if you have more anti-squat, you can actually have a harsher suspension action, less anti-squat, and you can have a much more active platform there. So it does vary between the bikes, but the trail bikes are typically built for efficiency over anything else, whereas the enduro style bikes are built for outright capabilities on rough terrain. Now, although there's exceptions in both categories, it's more common on a trail bike to be able to climb without having to use the climb switch or a lockout or any additional compression than it would be on an enduro bike. Quite often on enduro bikes, you might see things like a coil shock, in which case you're really going to want to make the use of having some kind of climb switch or lockout, because there's a lot of suspension travel to move around when you're climbing. As I said, efficiency versus capability. Now, in terms of geometry on the bikes, they can have some similar things going on, but also some very different ones. So moving up from the cross-country bike that will have a much steeper head angle and a shorter reach on the bike, a shorter wheelbase and a longer stem by comparison, most modern trail bikes come with anything from a 30mm stem up to probably a 50. They're probably topping out in that region. Wide bars, anything from 720 up to 800mm are commonplace. Again, that is a rider preference thing. There's no like fixed rule on what you should have. The stem length will be reflective of the actual length of the bike and of course your height and preferences. Now the seat angles on the bikes varies massively as well. On a much bigger travel enduro bike, you will always need to have a slightly steeper seat angle to maintain your position when climbing, otherwise the whole bike is going to be sagging around. Whereas on a trail bike, it doesn't have to be quite as steep. That said, you can have seat angles anywhere from 75 to around 77, whereas on an enduro bike, anything up to nearly 80 degrees on some extreme examples. But the late 70s is roughly where you're seeing modern enduro bikes with seat angles. Chainstays tends to be slightly shorter on the more responsive trail bike, anything from 430 up to around 440, depending on the brand and the size of bike. Whereas on the enduro bikes, you can expect to find chainstays up to 450mm, which is much closer to what downhill bikes have. Now with suspension in terms of travel and suspension units, things vary immensely across the categories. As I said before, on the trail bike, you can have anything from 125 up to 150mm, and you can typically find a suspension fork on the front having about 10mm more travel. This bike, for example, is running 130 on the rear and 140 on the front. It's quite common to have more travel on trail bikes, whereas cross-country bikes tend to have quite matched travel in general. With the suspension forks themselves, you'll find 34mm stanchions as the absolute minimum. On a trail bike, you won't find skinnier forks than that, but you can have anything up to 36 as you see on this bike, which is a bit stiffer and a bit more capable. On the enduro bike, you're going to have a minimum of 36 and up to 38mm, as you're seeing with the new Zeb and the Fox 38 that's on this bike here. That bit stiffer, that bit stronger, offers more control for a better support on a bigger travel fork. When it comes to the actual shock absorbers themselves though, they vary too. Now on trail bikes, you can have regular air shocks, or like this bike here, this one has a piggyback on there for slightly better response, better performance in more demanding conditions. It's a great option, but it does have a weight penalty versus a regular air shock. On the enduro bike, you're pretty much always going to find a shock that's got a piggyback. More often than not these days, you're going to find a coil shock on the rear for optimum performance when it's really rough. And with wheel travel on the enduro bikes, you'll find anything, as explained before, 150 up to about 170 on the rear and up to 180 on the front. Gearing on both trail and enduro style bikes is pretty similar these days, to be fair. Most modern bikes will have a 1x12 system, so that is a single sprocket at the front and 12 on the rear. Now, of course, you can still get some bikes running a double setup on the front, which just means you get more gears on the bike. But really, 1x12 is a fairly common approach on both styles of bikes. Crank length, however, does vary. The trail bike is more about your pedaling efficiency, so you tend to have cranks 170mm and perhaps 175, whereas on the enduro bike, it's about ground clearance because you've got more suspension going on, you're riding them in much more demanding terrain with rocks and stumps, so you can have cranks as short as 160mm, again depending on the rider height, the travel of the bike, that sort of thing, but massively different. More about efficiency, more about control. So you've got two different beasts, although they do look kind of similar. Disc brakes, again, on both bikes, it is about control, of course, very powerful brakes, but you'll have a slightly more lightweight bias on a trail bike. You can have anything from 2-pot brakes up to 4-pot brakes. My bike actually has a 4-pot on the front and a 2-pot on the rear. I don't need quite as much power on this bike, it's very easy to lock up the back wheel. Disc rotor size you can expect to find at 180mm and perhaps a slightly larger 200 or 203 on the front with the trail bike, whereas on the enduro bike, maximum stopping power. So you're going to have 4-piston or 4-pot brakes front and rear, and minimum of 180 on the rear and 203 or 200 on the front, but anything up to 200 or 203 on the rear and 220 on the front. all about stopping power and maximising on that on the roughest tracks. As for wheels and tyres, there's definitely some similarities between the two, and it really depends what you're going to be doing with the bike. Now with the wheels themselves, you can get alloy wheels and you can get carbon wheels, and of course lightweight wheels and heavy duty wheels. On a trail bike, you've got the benefit of speccing it as you want. So you can have some super lightweight virgin on cross-country wheels if that's your intention for the bike, all the way through to proper enduro capable wheels as I've got on here. But you might notice I have trail style tyres. So although they've got a heavy duty tread on them, the casing is much lighter, so closer to what a cross-country tyre would offer compared to an enduro casing tyre. Now this one at the moment does actually have the same tyres on there, but enduro casing tyres are what you will see when the bikes are being raced. They're much thicker, 4-ply sidewall, so more, like basically 4 layers of rubber there, much closer to downhill tyres in terms of the way that they're built. You can see different rubber compounds across both bikes. On a trail bike, you might have a slightly faster rolling rubber compound perhaps, whereas on the enduro bike, it's all about giving maximum grip in demanding conditions. So you'll have softer rubber and something with a very aggressive pattern. However though, as I say, there's no rule to the tyres. It will be down to what you're actually doing on the bike. And you can have a bike with enduro spec wheels and tyres on a trail bike, and it could outperform an enduro bike with the opposite on there, just in terms of what the wheels can achieve. So it's a dramatic difference you can do between them. One last thing with the tyres on the bikes, you can also spec tyre inserts on the inside. So tubeless tyres are fairly commonplace across the board with trail bikes and enduro bikes, but you can still split the tyres when you hit rocks extremely hard. Now, you don't see it quite as much on trail bikes, but I actually do like to run an insert on the rear just to afford myself a bit more protection, whereas enduro race bikes almost certainly will have some form of insert on the tyre there. Pedals on both style bikes tends to be down to rider preference. There'll be flat pedals or clips. If the rider's choosing to use clips, there'll be something like these pedals here, which although does have a clipless mechanism on the middle of the pedal, has a bigger cage than you would expect to find on the cross-country pedals. It's a bit more sure-footed, gives you more contact with your shoe, and it protects the pedal mechanism as well. The flat pedal approach, of course, they're just going to be what the rider prefers to have.
If you're buying a new set of wheels, there's a lot to consider. There's wheel diameter, rim width, spoke count, and then there's that age-old debate of alloy versus carbon. Well, today I'm going to hone into that last one and pit the two materials against each other in order to help you decide which one you want. So if you like content like this and you want some more helpful advice in the future, don't forget to like and subscribe. I do love a mixed wheel setup. We're here in Finale Ligure, arguably the home of Enduro, and that got me thinking about the pros in the Enduro World Cup scene, because they're at the height of their game, but they're choosing alloy wheels instead of carbon. But why is that? So carbon wheels are known to be stiff and strong, and you would expect the pros to be choosing that over alloy. I mean, to be fair, an alloy wheel can be built strong and stiff as well. You can have different alloy materials, different rim widths, even different spokes and different spoke tension can help you achieve that. But the real reason that Enduro World Cup riders are choosing alloy over carbon is more of a safety feature. Not to say that carbon is not safe, however, if you were to hit something, then alloy is more likely to bend and dent, whereas carbon is more likely to crack. So that means that there won't be a complete seal around the bead for the tyre. And Enduro World Cup riders, they don't have a pit stop. They have to complete the race on the same bike and the same set of wheels. So we can kind of see why they're making that choice over carbon. By contrast, you'll see the vast majority of riders, if not all of the riders, in the cross-country World Cup scene will be on carbon wheels. Now, the big difference between cross-country racing and enduro racing is that cross-country will have a tech zone, and they will be able to pull off during a race and swap out a wheel if they need to. Also, manufacturers can change the rim profile and the depths and even adapt the way they lay up the carbon in order to make these rims really stiff but also very light. And this will be a benefit to cross-country racers who want a light set of wheels so that they're easier to accelerate, easier to climb, but also still stiff enough to take the speed and the technicality of current World Cup races. When it comes to professional downhill riders, there's still a real mix when it comes to choosing between carbon and alloy rims. Of course, the vast majority of downhillers are sponsored pros rather than privateers spending their own money, but teams like Pivot Factory Racing, who are sponsored by Reynolds Wheels, will probably have the pick of whatever they want, and yet they choose to run carbon exclusively. Now let's not forget trail riding, because this is probably what most of us do. Not XC smashing and not enduro ploughing, just good old-fashioned fun in the single track. With most trail bikes being circa 140mm and typically being referred to as short travel bikes, feedback from wheels becomes much more noticeable. So you could argue that this is the category where wheels matter the most. Now, a good set of carbon wheels will make the bike snappier and more responsive, as they are, generally speaking, a lot stiffer. But bear in mind that no two sets of wheels are built alike. For example, carbon rims can be built to add strength for the jump park, for example, but they also can be built to be much lighter if your trail riding is all about those long days in the saddle. So let's talk about price and weight, and a little disclaimer here. Obviously, I've ridden two different brands of wheels to get my carbon and my alloy. However, both wheels have a similar internal and external width on the rim, and they are both used for a similar application. So the FSA carbon wheels weigh 1,736 grams as a pair of 29ers, and they cost $1,660. Now, the Spank alloy wheels will weigh 2,127 grams, but they cost $770. So often there is a relationship between price and weight, and sometimes you either have to choose a lighter wheel set or something that's lighter on the wallet. Now, the reason behind this is that carbon, pound for pound, is much stronger than metal, which means that you can use less material in order to have the same strength rating. So less material obviously means lighter, but that raw material for carbon is much more expensive than alloy. And it also requires a hand-making process to be laid up and then often cured in a mold. So the labor costs and the time are much more costly as well. So it's horses for courses, but let's head back onto the trail and see what this actually feels like in real life. I do love a mixed wheel setup, I'll tell you that. Definitely rocky around finale. Oh, finale is rough, but yeah, it would be interesting to see whether I actually noticed that there was compliance on these when I switch over to carbon. Am I going to get more speed in the corners? Who knows? Let's switch them out. Right, it's carbon time. Oh, they look so pretty. And then we have the carbon wheels. Oh, let me catch my breath, sit down on a step over there, and I'll tell you my thoughts. Okay, so that's carbon versus alloy, and I've got to say, there wasn't a huge amount of difference here. I would say, well, first off, disclaimer, I am less than 60 kilos, so I don't think I would put as much force through the wheels as a heavier or a really fast pro rider, for example. But I did notice the carbon wheels and the alloy wheels were most noticeable going through rock gardens. Now, the carbon wheels would kind of draw a straight line straight through anything that was rough, whereas the alloy wheels kind of pinged a little bit. Now, I should imagine that's to do with the alloy wheels having a bit of flex, but I didn't find it off-putting when I was riding them. And I must admit, had I have ridden them all day, would the carbon wheels be more fatiguing, even though they're more precise? So I guess that's the kind of trade-off that you'll make with the two materials.
High-end mountain bike
Versus a low-end mountain bike.
the bike you want.
Versus the bike you need. This bike is worth £2,000.
And this bike is worth £4,650.
But is it worth the money? Is it twice the bike?
We're going to look into where the spec is high on this one and where they've added tech, and we're going to look at that one where they've saved a little bit of tech. Here on GMBN Tech, we're often talking about the latest and greatest in tech for bikes. And often a lot of these innovations come with a high price tag. But to flag, we really like entry-level bikes too. And here's more info on one.
Tech advancements are really important too. There was a time when 1x12 drivetrains and even suspension was reserved for the high-end bikes, and now we have them trickle down to the low end. But I'm not going to stand here and tell you that high-end bikes are not worth the price tag, that they're a rip-off, because I just don't believe that. There is a reason why tech costs more, and today we're going to explore those reasons, show you the differences so that you can make an informed decision as to whether you feel it's worth the price tag.
The high-end bike I've got here is, well, it's actually Neil's, but it is a Canyon Spectral CF9. CF stands for carbon fibre, so we've got a full carbon frame, including the rear swing arm and the chainstay. It's also got Canyon's new KISS system, a steering stabiliser. This one has got electronic gears, so we've got a wireless shifter up here, and then we've got the new T-Type GX on the back. In terms of other spec, well, this one is slightly different, so it would be even more expensive. We've upgraded the wheels and the tyres. Well, we've probably upgraded the pedals too from what you'd get stock, but it's a really nice bike. But what are the differences in this compared to the aluminium bike?
Well, that is a lovely bike that Neil has, but I've just taken delivery of the Canyon Spectral AL5. Now, the AL stands for aluminium or aluminum, depending on what country you are, or shall we just say alloy from now on? But it is largely the same bike. So the aluminium versions of the Spectral have largely the same geometry and the same proportions as the carbon versions. There may be some variation depending on the wheel size, but they are the same bike with the same purpose. They have the same travel. In fact, I have RockShox, the same as Neil. I just have less adjustment on them. I also have a drivetrain that is 1x12 as well. It's just mechanical instead of wireless, and there's slightly less adjustment on my brakes, but they still work. The wheels still go round. But is it worth the saving, or is there some compromise somewhere? Is Neil's bike worth twice as much? I guess we should dive into it in more detail.
As well as the KIS steering stabiliser, we've got some other really nice features on this carbon frame. We've got fully integrated cable routing in a really nice setup. You've only got two cables here because we've got the electronic wireless shifting. The other things that are nice to note is that we've got internal frame storage here, so you can actually pop the bottle out and there's a whole hatch underneath where you can put, well, anything. You can put a sandwich or probably something more practical like a tube and maybe a tool. Speaking of tools, there's also a little tool mount already integrated on here with a tool, which is handy.
So I don't have many of those features at all. There's no KIS, there's no flip chips, there's no internal storage or integrated tool storage. And that's largely where a lot of the savings have been made. Not to mention the alloy is a much cheaper raw material and it's quicker to assemble. And all of that combined together can often make this frame around about £1,000 cheaper than Owen's bike over there. So I guess the question is, are all those features worth the extra price tag from you? Well, that's the conclusion from the frame section. So let's compare suspension, because we're both on RockShox, but I've got the RockShox Deluxe Select Plus in the rear here. What have you got?
I've got a Super Deluxe Ultimate.
Excellent. And up front, I've got the RockShox 35 Silver TK.
Oh yes, TK for turnkey, which is a different damper. Whereas I've got the Lyric Ultimate, so I've got lots of bells and whistles in terms of damping adjustment.
But according to the Canyon site, the weight is actually the same. So it's all in the dampers, the parts, the performance of what's going on inside, really. That's the big difference here. So obviously you said the TK is turnkey, so I've got this sort of one adjustment for my compression that's very much just a sort of a volume dial.
So I've got the Lyric Ultimate and we've got more knobs and more dials and lots more adjustments. So for compression, I've got high speed and low speed. And for rebound, well, I've just got one rebound adjuster, but it's got lots of clicks, which is good. It gives you much more range and more spring rate to work with. So how it works should offer a bit more support and ease of use, if you know what you're doing.
Yeah, so I've got less clicks and adjustment on my compression, whereas you're separating out your high speed and your low speed compression. We both have a rebound dial on the bottom to control the rebound, so that's very similar. However, we know that Neil's bike isn't the top of top specs. Rich has that, and he has the Fox factory suspension, which even further separates out the rebound into low speed and high speed. So that's well, that's the big difference in performance between the two of ours. But let's talk about price, shall we? Because my forks alone, around about, depending on the spec, around about £300, and yours about £600 to £800 for just the forks, right?
Quite a chunk more, isn't it? So yeah, I mean, I guess it's how the fork is made in terms of the damping unit, this Charger Damper 3 that I've talked about. It's not only kind of got more dials and bells and whistles, the way it works is more specific, and how it's assembled, there's lots of smaller parts and it needs to be assembled in the right way. So it is more expensive. So you could upgrade the damping. You're still not going to have the same weight chassis, because this one's got alloy stanchions, so the kind of uppers of the fork, if you like, are aluminium, whereas on this fork they're just steel. But you could upgrade the damper, and that's the kind of the main thing that's going to change the ride feel and the ride experience. I guess the other thing about both suspension systems, they're built to sort of work for a medium-ish rider. So if you're coming from either a hardtail where you've not experienced suspension before, or you kind of ride sort of in the middle of all your settings and you don't really use the extra damping adjustments that you might have on the bike you've got, well, actually the suspension on this one should work really nicely in that medium bit. I guess it's when you're pushing kind of on a little bit further in terms of how you set the bike up, that all the bells and whistles on these dampers, well, they should work better and you should be able to get a better setup.
If you know what you're doing, but watch our videos if you don't. You can learn a bit about suspension setup. But anyway, hopefully that explains a little bit about where the extra money is going into performance and adjustability on Owen's bike versus mine. But as we mentioned, if you're not sure, you can always start with this and upgrade later. So it's up to you to decide whether the price tag is worth it right now.
We touched on the fact that I've got wireless group set, but what's that actually mean? Well, it means, well, I've got less things. I've got less cables, I've got less inner cables as well. So I've got a wireless shifter here on the handlebar, which talks magically to this wonderful rear mech. And this is the newer SRAM stuff. This is the T-type. So we've got a direct mounted rear mech that's a lot more stable, a lot more stiff. That's what SRAM say. We've got a different chain as well, so it's got a flat top, which is meant to be stiffer and work better in this 1x12 setup. All of that, well, lessness does come at more of a price. So we're looking at, well, starting from over £1,000 for a wireless drivetrain like this. You can get cheaper versions that isn't T-type, but if you want the newest, latest stuff, it is quite spendy.
That is definitely more expensive than what I've got, which is good old-fashioned mechanical group set, which we've had for many, many years, which means that the technology has been around for many years. We can benefit from economies of scale, which means we can buy it in bulk and it's cheaper. The materials are cheaper as well. Usually if we look at things like the cassettes on a lower spec group set, we often get rings that are riveted together, whereas often high-end cassettes are usually machined out of one piece, which takes a lot of time and is a more expensive process. So the cassettes can be a bit heavier, but often they are more durable. So if they're made out of steel, which is cheaper, that can be more durable than, say, a high-spec cassette that's made out of titanium and aluminium, which can wear out a lot quicker. Also, being mechanical and being as it's been around for many years, it means that we can get replacements very easily. We can rock up into bike shops and get new cables and new parts that generally fit most group sets. So what's the key difference here? Well, I have to push a lever rather than touch a button, and my shifters don't integrate with my brakes, which is a little bit upsetting in terms of handlebar aesthetics, but it's really not the end of the world. And in terms of price difference, well, your group set is about £1,200, and mine is about £400. So I guess the question is on this part is all of that technology worth the extra money? Of course, there are plenty of middle grounds out there. So yeah, explore and pick something that's within your budget, because don't forget that this is a consumable product that will eventually wear out and you'll have to replace it anyway.
We've talked about go, now let's talk about stop. There's some really big differences with the brakes that we've got here. And okay, they might seem minor, and depending on what brakes you're coming from, they might not make up to much. But from a brand's perspective, these have got all the bells and whistles. We've got a reach adjustment that's got a little tool on, which is really nice to have actually. You've got to use an Allen key on yours.
I do.
We've also got a bike point adjuster. So this is kind of moving the pads closer, and it really does change the feel of the levers. So I can set them up exactly where I want to. And the Code RSCs also have a nice little linkage in here that plays really nicely with where that lever is and gives me lots of progression. So there's lots of adjustment in the levers themselves. Down at the caliper, well, the calipers are really quite similar to a degree, because we've both got 4 pistons, we've both got relatively big brake pads, which offer up quite a bit of braking performance. And talking about braking performance, my brakes are filled with DOT 5.1 fluid. You could put DOT 4 in there as well. And you might wonder, why are we talking about brake fluids? Does it really matter? Well, SRAM says it does, and that's why they use a higher performance DOT 5.1 in these. It's got a higher boiling point, but it does need a little bit more servicing, whereas the brakes that you've got use mineral fluid, which is quite new for SRAM, but they use mineral fluid because whilst it doesn't have the peak performance of these brakes, it can last without service intervals for much longer.
Yeah, I think if you're not steaming down long alpine descents, it's very rare that you're going to reach that boiling point on the fluid. Personally, that's my opinion.
And I think that's a really good point, is we're about this size, but if you're kind of like much bigger or much smaller, depending on if you need more reach adjustment or you're just a bigger person, you might need more stopping power. So it is something just to think about. And that loops back to rotors. I've got a big 200 on the front and a 200 rotor on the rear, whereas on your bike you've got a 180 on the rear and a 200 on the front.
Yeah, and it's not just about size here, because obviously I could change that rear up to be a different size if I wanted to, but often with low-end brakes you get lower-end discs, and I do think this is one of the things that makes a big difference. So often with the low-end discs you'll have a cheaper material which can be softer than, say, what Owen's got over there, which means they can warp easier, they can wear quicker, but these are things that you can potentially upgrade later on if it doesn't work out for you. So Canyon have spec'd my bike with the Raceface AR30 wheels, and the big difference between mine and Owen's will be that these are aluminium rims, whereas his will be carbon. Now I'm rolling on a Shimano MT400 hub here, which has a 90-tooth ratchet in it, and what that means is it has a 4-degree engagement. So what that means in reality is it may take up to 4 degrees before your pedal feels like it engages and you start moving. Whether that is a big concern for you, is for you to decide or not. But what I do like about these wheels is that we've got 32 spokes here. So more spokes, I always say more reliable, because if anything breaks, then you've still got a lot of points of contact around here. You've also got J-bend spokes, which are really common. If anything goes wrong, it's very likely that there will be spares in your bike shop as well. And yeah, well, generally, I think another big difference will be weight probably, and price. So obviously these will bring the price down and the weight will go up. These are about 2.5 kilos as a wheel set. And because I've got OE spec tires on here, not top of the range ones here, there'll be more rubber to nylon ratio potentially, but these are 1 kilo each as well. But of course, these are upgradable over time if you need to. Which is what you've done, Owen, actually.
Exactly. We've upgraded to these Reynolds Black Label wheels, which I think we've talked about weight, and it is a substantial savings. These wheels are about 1,600 grams, so it's a really big chunk of weight. It's also rotational weight, so you can feel the weight difference. That sounds a bit daft. There's lots going on in terms of rolling resistance and the science behind the inertia of a lighter wheel, but it is something you can feel. The other thing with these wheels is that they've got this carbon rim, and that does change how the ride feels. So it's not just a weight saving, it's also about changing how the wheel works. And without getting into the complexities of how a carbon wheel can work and how it can feel versus an alloy, there are advantages to this. The other advantage is we've got bladed spokes, which help work with the carbon rim to give a really nice ride. What's interesting also about these wheels is we've got some really nice hubs. What do I mean by really nice hubs? I mean Industry 9 collabed with Reynolds to make these specific hubs. And that rear hub has got 120 points of engagement, so they do really engage really quickly.
And finally, some of the touch points and contact points can be a little different depending on what spec you buy. Now, we've actually both got aluminium handlebars here, but often with higher end bikes, you can get carbon handlebars or carbon finishing kit as well, can't you?
Yeah, you can. Sometimes you'll not have a dropper post, which to be honest is, well, dropper posts are really nice, but some of the OEM ones aren't that great. So it is something else to look at, looking at the specs. I guess the other point is, yeah, grips and saddles. Some entry point bikes will try and skimp a little bit on cheaper grips and cheaper saddle. And for most people, they can be good enough, but it's a really good place to upgrade because a saddle that you don't really feel and isn't annoying at all is worth its weight in gold.
But sometimes, if you're going to update your saddle anyway, then, well, you've not spent money on a high-end one that you're about to take off.
If you've heard the term Downcountry and you're confused, then this could be the video for you. Because today we're going to be comparing a Downcountry tyre and a cross-country tyre, working out exactly what they are, what they do, and if it's the right choice for you. You might have heard the term Downcountry being thrown around and probably wondered, what the heck is it? Well, essentially, it's aggressive cross-country riding. It's still done on cross-country bikes that often have a bit more travel. We're going to talk about this a bit later in the video. But something that's quite strange is there's now starting to be components coming out dedicated for Downcountry riding. Vittoria have just launched the Sierra tyre, which is a dedicated tyre for Downcountry riding. It sits between cross-country and trail. It's a dedicated tyre, it's brand new from the ground up, and to find out exactly what it does and if it's suitable for you, Rich is out on the trail with a set of cross-country tyres and the Downcountry tyres on 2 different bikes, and he's going to run them back to back to give you a bit of sort of commentary on them, and we're going to jump back here and I'm going to give you all the tech breakdown so you can figure out if it's light enough, if it does all the stuff you need a tyre to do, and ultimately figure out, do you need a Downcountry tyre or not? That name Downcountry was actually just a bit of a tongue-in-cheek nickname given by journalist Mike Levy to the type of cross-country riding he was doing. Now Mike, like myself and many other people that enjoy cross-country riding, was not that fussed about the racing and wanted a bit more control from the bike. And there's also a little bit of confusion about the bikes themselves. So let's just get this done and then we get back to Rich out on the trail. Now, cross-country race bikes, they're super lightweight and they have up to 100 millimeters of travel. They're still cross-country bikes, they're still cross-country race bikes. A Downcountry bike might have 110 on the rear and up to 120 on the front, but it's still a cross-country bike, okay? It's still mega lightweight and it's still designed to race, but It was just designed to handle more technical environments and, as the sport progresses, to handle what's coming down the line. Now, these sorts of bikes, as well as just being XC race bikes, are perfect for multi-day events, things like the Cape Epic or perhaps the BC Bike Race. Bingo, that's Downcountry.
I'm going to delve into the practical side of these tyres out here on the trail. Then later on in the video, we'll hand it over to our super clever tech guy, Doddy, to really split hairs when it comes to the spec of these tyres. But first, the XC tyre. Woo! Right then, we'll ease in on a blue run and get a feel for the tyres. XC tyres, I ride the Spike a lot, so I'm pretty used to how it handles and how it feels. Because of the lightweight nature of XC tyres, I do run my pressures a bit firmer. Casing is thinner. With thinner casing, does come way lighter weight, 550 grams, but you gotta be a bit careful on them. Pressures are a bit firmer, but you know what? I think it's worth it. On an XC race bike, you need XC tyres. Oh my God. Oh, that was rougher than I thought. The firm pressures is making her a little skittish. And I don't want to puncture. Ooh. You've got to remember the use it's intended for. Oh, corner grip is sacrificed slightly. Oh, help. Thinner casings and narrower tyres do mean lighter tyres, which, if you're a racer, means a lot. It also could potentially mean less rolling resistance. Speedy bike swap done then, it's time to put these Downcountry tyres through their paces. Okay, on the trail then, instantly I can notice the wider tread pattern, and this is giving me more confidence. Right, with the thicker casing, I can run lower pressures, which gives me more grip. And manuels, oh. You might argue that rolling resistance is a little higher due to the more aggressive tread pattern and width, but you got to remember what the tyre is meant for. Oh wow, it's in the turns that you can really feel the grip on the Downcountry tyre. Oh, actually do confidence inspiring here. Oh. Okay, well, do you know what, that was fun. That's the riding side taken care of then by me. But do you know what, let's delve more into the tech and draft in Doddy. So buddy, over to you.
Nice one, Rich. Let's talk tyre tech. Okay, so the Downcountry tyre then. What makes this different then from that cross-country race tyre? So this is a Vittoria Sierra, it's 29 by 2.4, and it's designed to give you the best of everything possible that you'd want to do on a cross-country bike. It's designed to roll fast, it's designed to carve a corner a bit more like a trail tyre, and it's designed to offer you the support to run it at much lower pressures. Low pressures equal loads of comfort, they equal loads of traction, okay? Stuff that you can't necessarily get with an out-and-out race tyre unless you're extremely lightweight or light on the bike. Now, traditional cross-country race tyres have 120 TPI casing, so it's very thin, fine threads and enables the casing to be very supple. That's amazing for ride qualities. You really get an extremely comfortable ride on them. The downside is there's almost no protection with a casing that's that thin. To get around this, Vittoria have made this Sierra a 60 TPI casing. So the threads are thicker, they're much stronger and much more supportive. So you've got loads of sidewall support. I mean, you can drop the pressures right down. We're talking like sub 20 pounds quite comfortably. A 170 pound rider could run these, for example, about 18 PSI with no problems at all. You're maximizing the spread on the ground, you get all the support that you need. Added to this, they have the sidewall inserts you see on these Enduro style tyres to help protection against pinch flats, and they have a revolutionary new tread concept on the tyre itself as well. So on a cross-country tyre like this Barzo, it still has 4 compounds, but they're geared against rolling as fast as possible. It has 2 of those compounds on the main tread to make them roll nice and fast, but it has a very different shoulder. Because of the fact the tyre has a 60 TPI casing and can offer more support, they give you a big edge that you would get on a trail tyre like that Mazda. It's like a compact version to enable you to really carve an edge, which you can do thanks to that casing support. And that shoulder tread has 2 softer compounds that are taken from the trail style tyre. So it really is a hybrid tyre, offering you the best of both worlds.
The rides are done then, and down country, cross country, all country. Do you know what? It's been really fun riding them both. To summarise though, which is better, which is worse? Well, there isn't one that is better or worse. They're both fit for the purposes they're designed for, and that is something you really have to remember when choosing between the two. The cross-country tyre with its fast rolling and super lightweight thin sidewalls is a race tyre. The down-country tyre, well, that's like the downhiller's XC tyre if you like. Thicker casing, slightly wider tread and a bit more aggressive means you can push it that bit harder. It's a trade-off between the two and something that you're going to need to think about.
The dropper post is one of the best things on the bike in terms of giving you confidence when descending. But then again, so is front and rear suspension, but in a completely different way. So what then makes more difference in terms of giving you confidence and speed when descending on rough ground? A rigid bike equipped with a dropper post, or a full suspension bike with a rigid seat post? Let's find out, shall we? Now, in case it's not obvious, I literally love everything about mountain bike technology. Carbon, alloy, 27.5-inch wheels, 29-inch wheels, tubeless, hydraulic disc brakes, full suspension that's adjustable, coil suspension, air suspension, electronic dropper post, literally you name it, I love it. But more than a few times on the channel, I've actually commented saying I think that the dropper post makes more of a significant difference in terms of the benefits that you can get when handling off-road, mainly because you can get the bike out the way between your legs and you can move around using your entire body for suspension. And I've basically said I thought I could ride one of those a bit better than another setup. And quite a few people called me out on it. So, well, today that's exactly what we're going to be doing. We're going to be riding 2 similar yet very different bikes. So let's have a look at the bikes and we'll explain what we're going to be doing. Now, this bike here is an Orbea Alma. It's a cross-country bike. It's completely rigid. I would say it's a super bike. It's incredibly light. It's around 20 pounds in weight, and it's equipped with a dropper post. Okay, so that dropper post enables me to get the saddle out the way. The bike can ricochet around underneath me, hopefully, and enabling me to ride with nice control. And then the other bike is a Canyon Lux. Now, this one is a Lux Trail. It's got 110 millimeters of travel at the back, 120 at the front, and it's a very lightweight bike, although it's probably 5 or 6 pounds heavier than the Orbea there. Now, a few of you will notice that I've got a dropper post on here, but because this one is a reverb dropper post and it's an access one, all I've got to do is take the battery off the back here by flicking this little lever. I could just leave it on the floor, or I could give it to the cameraman, and it effectively becomes a rigid seat post. That's also a really nice, cool trick you can play to your friends that's got one of those before they tackle a downhill. Now, we're going to do a bunch of different things out on the trail to demonstrate what is good about the 2 different setups and where you can get advantages. Now, which one should I ride first? What do you reckon, Louis? Okay, full sus it is. Let's go, shall we? So there's already a couple of observations I'd completely forgotten about. So I grew up riding rigid bikes with no dropper posts, and coming somewhere like this, you put the saddle down a little bit just to get it out of the way. And what you forget when your saddle's up totally affects the position on the bike. So once you get a hang of it, you can start getting behind the saddle, which is good to get out of the way, but it's not necessarily the correct riding position. Being neutral on the bike is always going to be the best, and being low is the best, which with the saddle up makes it so difficult, especially when you're tall like me, because your height is so high up. You feel like a pendulum. Even the slightest bump feels like it's going to push you forwards on the bike. The way it covers ground, look at this, so smooth across the ground. So as soon as you get to features, oh my God, you're at the absolute mercy. I am 100% relying on the suspensions to save me. Now, what I'm discovering on here is I'm using all of my suspension travel, riding a really basic section of trail here at what I think's a mediocre speed. The saddle was kicking me the whole time. And ironically, because the bike, so this is a Lux Trail, it's a little bit longer than some cross-country bikes. So I'm running a 50mm stem on here. Normally on cross-country bikes, in my sort of size, I'm running like 80, sometimes a 90mm stem like I am on the Orbea. Because that extra length, it makes it even harder to get off the back of the saddle. So on bikes of old that were rigid, with no suspension, no drop posts, the saddle will be hitting you in the chest because you're going off the back of the saddle. I'm finding it really difficult to even get in that position. This is where it doesn't feel especially nice with that saddle up. Whoa! Rigid bike, dropper post. This is pretty flipping bumpy along here. Oh! Oh my God! Oh my balls! I just ball checked the back of the saddle. Oh, I'd completely forgotten, to be honest, just how chattery a completely rigid bike is. And obviously, there's nowhere for the bumps to go other than your tyres. They come straight through to you. Even the smallest little jump, I felt like I did a massive jump. Because the size of it, it's only about that big. Speed though, don't think I've got it on this one. Making all sorts of weird noises up here. Oh my God. God. Absolutely horrific. I feel like I've got a bit of neck trauma after that. You're tensing so hard to try and stay in one piece. I mean, admittedly, this isn't a cross-country trail. This trail, it's closed by the way, in case you wonder why I'm walking up it, so we're okay for filming. This trail is actually a bit more of an enduro style trail, so it's kind of a little bit unfair on the rigid bike on here, but say again, the saddle position you can achieve with a dropper post whilst riding is you can obviously lower your saddle with an Allen key or quick release, but the ability to lower it and raise it as you're riding changes everything. I said for a long time, geometry and riding position are the two biggest things, like bike fit basically, the two biggest things in terms of performance on a bike. Everything else comes along for the ride, and yes, everything else will enhance your ride and enable you to do other things, but I'm like blown away by how comfortable, even though it's painful, it feels like I can ride this trail. Yeah, I was riding the bike with full suspension on the same trail and I felt so restricted by it. And of course you would dial in either way, you know. I used to ride a rigid bike with the saddle up and got used to that. So, but obviously for this comparison, I'm not used to a suspension bike with a high post and I'm not used to a rigid bike at all either. So pretty realistic. I've got to say, I'm not looking forward to getting back on a full suspension bike though. Even though it's by far quicker on rough ground, as soon as there's proper lumps and bumps and drops and things, the control that you can get with a low seat makes all the difference.
Now this sort of stuff, a rigid bike's not going to compete with, because the saddle is not affecting me and the bike just glides across the surface.
You've got loads of traction. It's just so fast. Can a rigid bike be quicker than this? I'm not sure it can, even for the benefits of the riding position. Okay, so now we've seen both setups in different areas, but this really is where suspension comes in. And there's no question that riding rooty, rough terrain can be done better on a suspension bike. Now, I know some purists will say, yeah, okay, it's down to line choice, but let's be realistic about this. Suspension enables you to cover ground much more efficiently. Rigid bike certainly does climb nicely, but you most definitely have to consider your line choice. And this is in the bone dry. If this is in the wet, it would be a completely different thing. Okay then, observations so far. I've ridden both the bikes on a variety of different trails, some of which, granted, you shouldn't really be riding on these sorts of bikes, not their intention. But that said, you know, they've both dealt with it really well in completely different ways. The rigid bike with a drop out of the way, I just felt like it was faster everywhere, but that's probably because I felt every single bump and I was out of control most of the time. Thankfully, saddle out of the way makes a significant difference. Opposite could be said though of the full suspension bike. You're really desensitised to the bumps by comparison to the rigid bike, but I felt so nervous and cautious of the saddle constantly being underneath me. But as soon as things opened up a bit more, and there's not much in the way of sort of bumps and whoops and stuff, full suspension bike just covers ground so much faster. And the same could be said, you know, we did a little bit of climbing stuff and some rooty stuff. The rigid bike is really difficult in the dry on routes, going up and down, let alone in the wet. Full suspension bike, you've got traction, you've got comfort, you've got everything. But now what we're going to do is put both the bikes on a trail, a blue graded trail that's quite appropriate for both of them. I'm going to ride the entire descent, I'm going to time it on both bikes. Now this will be really interesting because there's a variety of different things on here. There's hard berms, there's turns, there's some drops and jumps and stuff on here, and there's also some whoops. The whoops and all that sort of stuff, that is going to feel horrendous with the saddle up. But the rest of the trail I think is going to feel quite bad on this bike because it's so chattery. And honestly at this stage, I don't know which one's going to be quicker. Let's find out. Okay, full suspension bike, rigid seat post. Timer on, let's go. So this is a blue rated descent. It's pretty slippy in places, so got to watch out. Can't go too hot, but I'm going to rely on the suspension of the bike to keep me in control. I say that, and I've got these whoops to contend with. And they make things really quite difficult because you can't get your body weight in a position to really control the bike. So some of those I can free jump, but the bigger ones, like that, are really quite difficult. But I can get the power down in between, which I think I'm going to struggle with on the other bike. Whew. Tell you what, the trail surface is so dry and so loose. It's definitely making things, whoa. There. Now it's going to be interesting to see what the time is on the other bike. Fully rigid bike with a dropper post now. Let's see how much difference this makes. Okay, again, got to be careful because it's mega slippy and I've got no suspension to help me. But I have got
the ability to change my weight around on the bike a bit more, which Dave felt so much nicer. Yeah. Feel a bit more in control than I did on the other bike. Okay, this is hard work on the chattery stuff, that's for sure. Just trying to focus and not crash there. I'm completely honest, it is so slippery.
Okay then, how has today gone? Well, I've got some interesting results to tell you about, but before we get there, let's just talk about my experience of riding the two bikes. Now, as I explained at the beginning of the video, I grew up riding rigid bikes, and there was no such thing as disc brakes even, let alone dropper posts. So I'm more than familiar with this, but it did take me a bit to get used to it. But the bigger 29-inch wheels from what I grew up riding, definitely irons out some stuff. But that said, I've had an absolute drilling today on my hands, really rattled myself. I've loved riding this over the full suspension bike with the saddle down because I can maneuver the bike around and do what I want with it. With the full suspension bike, I very much felt like a passenger, and that's just not the way I like to ride. However, there's just simply no arguing with full suspension when it comes to covering ground. It just irons out the bumps, enables you to brake where you need to brake. You can pedal over things like roots and adverse terrain. It's just, full suspension is simply incredible. But also, as I explained in the video, you don't need all of this technology to go and have fun on mountain bikes. You just need a basic mountain bike and some woods. Okay then, timings. Now, this was quite interesting. I rode the Blue Descent here in the Forest of Dean, set off on the full suspension Lux first. And as I was riding, I thought, do you know what? I'm not sure I can ride it too much faster, at least in the turns, because of the amount of traction on offer. And the thing I felt that was limiting me was the whoops, because I literally couldn't ride them any faster without getting airborne and kicked out the bum. So I rode it at a speed I felt comfortable I could sustain, got to the bottom. 2:57 was my time on that bike. By the time I got my hand off the bars, managed to stop the timer. But here's the interesting thing. Albeit, saddle down, I was sliding around loads more, but as soon as I got to the whoops, because of the fact I could let the bike move around underneath me, I felt I could generate speed through there. And that is everything to me in the way that I like to ride. I like to be in control of what I'm doing with the bike. I don't want to be a passenger like I was riding with the Lux there. And as a result, I ended up with 250. 7 seconds quicker, even though I felt like I was out of control more on that bike for sliding around. It just goes to show what you can do when you manipulate the bike around underneath you. I'm really pleased that the bike with no suspension and the dropper post won, because as I said at the beginning of the video, I'm a huge fan of the dropper post. Yeah, sure, you can lower your seat and you can get the same effect. No problem at all. I'm not suggesting everyone goes out and buys a dropper post. But the fact is, if you want to get out on the trails and get the most from your bike without having to stop and faff around with that, a dropper post can really significantly help that, even over suspension, or at least in the test that I did today. What I love to get from a bike is moving it around. That's the thing that I love, and therefore, I'm going to go with that as my favourite choice today, and it was the fastest choice, although I feel like I've been beaten up by it. But that is something you can get used to.
Are more expensive lights worth it? Well, we're going to illuminate the cheap light versus expensive light debate with a night ride. Let's begin. Night riding is awesome. There, I've said it. It's so incredible. It can shine a whole new light on your local trails, allowing you to see them in a whole new way. But do well-known brands of light really stack up against, well, those no-name brands that you might see on the internet? We're going to walk through the differences between some well-established brands and some brand names that, well, we've never heard of, and see how they perform on the trail. We're talking about lights. Yeah. Two lights, because it's really good, especially on mountain bike trail, and especially more technical mountain bike trail, to run two sets of lights. And that's because, well, as you're riding, you get different depth of field from having lights in different positions, so one up on your helmet and one on the bar. Also, the other thing is mountain biking goes through wonderful, twisty, sinewy single track, and that's really fantastic. But if your handlebars are pointing one way and you've got to look another way, well, it won't be illuminated. So having a light on your helmet means you can see literally where you're looking. So having a helmet light and a bar light is pretty much essential for mountain biking. we bought some fairly cheap lights from a factory to consumer portal website. Hopefully that covers all for all the different websites that you can get it. We made sure it was a mountain bike one, and we made sure that it was waterproof as well. Although confusingly, the list on this one initially said waterproof, and then when we checked again, it wasn't waterproof. For both of these lights, the cost was £21.59, including shipping. This is the packaging that it came in. It's not that jazzy, but hopefully it's got everything we need. Okay, we've got the box, which I think has got the lights in, yeah, and then we've got, okay, lots of bolts, a couple of elastic bands. I feel like that's the mounting hardware. Right, let's have a look at the lights. Right, here we go. Okay, we've got the light itself, which is, okay, on the description it did say it was all aluminium construction, but this isn't all aluminium. These end caps and sort of the end point of if it was dropped, they're plastic. It also lists both 10,000 lumens and 5,000 lumens as the maximum output, which I've got to admit is quite confusing. But we've got the light, it's all one piece, so that's quite nice. We've got a very unique mounting bracket, probably more on that later. USB, no instructions. Okay, that'll be a bit of choose your own adventure to how it charges and all of those kind of things. Okay, so that's the handlebar light. We also got a helmet mounted one as well. So this one is sort of similar. Right, we've got a round mount. So I guess you could mount it on a handlebar. This one you can mount as a headlamp. Thankfully this helmet's got two mounts, so I'll be able to run it. We've got a charger. That's an upgrade on the other box. We've got the light unit itself. Okay, that looks pretty much as advertised, although just going to be mounting it with elastic bands. So that's not stellar, but it's there. It lists a max of 2,000 lumens. We've got a fairly long cable. Here's a little battery pack. It is very small. Looks fairly tough. I think it might make a bit of rattling noise. I just wanted to check the battery because this one also said it was waterproof. Feels like it's been sealed with cardboard on the ends. Not sure that cardboard is waterproof. Okay, that's what you can get at the sort of cheaper end of the scale. As an example of a more premium brand or a brand name of lights, we've got these Outbound lights. I mean, they are a relatively small firm. They're based in the US. We've got a combo here of the Evo Trail and the Hangover helmet mount, and coming in at £290 for both lights. So this is the Trail Evo. So this is the nice little box we've got here. Okay, so what have we got? We've got the light and mounting hardware all set up already. That's nice. Got a little cardboard bit. Okay, we've got USB charging unit. That's great. Oh wow, we've even got an Allen key to adjust the clamp. Nice. Ooh, okay. This is really nerdy, but for me, this is really exciting. I know, instruction manuals. Who would have thought? Multi-page, loads of details. Yeah, it's nice. So listings wise, this one only has 2,200 lumens, which I've got to say does sound a lot lower, but in the instruction manuals, there's lots of details about all the different modes, including one called Adaptive, which will change how bright the light is. So it'll start off quite bright and then dim a little bit until it gets to a good base level. And that should last for 155 minutes. There's another 3 additional main full beam modes and also 2 flashing modes. It's all listed in the instructions there. And the light itself is really neat and tidy. It's very compact and the clamp looks like it's really simple to use, so no puzzling required. Okay, and here's the helmet light. This one's called the Hangover, fun name. It's fully wireless, so unlike the other system, I haven't got any batteries. It's just this. It's really slimline. It uses an action camera mount. Now, how long does it run? Well, it can run, again, it's got an adaptive setting where it peaks this high bright mode, which drops down a little bit while you're riding, and that can run for a whole 100 minutes. There's lots of other settings too, so you've got 3 other full solid light modes, and then you've got 2 flashing modes. Again, there's loads of details because it's got full instructions. Interesting. Real puzzle here, lots of parts. They look like they might fit together, but they're not really fitting together. So I'm gonna have to sort of bodge it. And as I've got no instructions, I'm really lost. It's like these would work on, well, some road bikes, but not all. So I've got a fix instead, which is using a Garmin mount, slightly modified, to run it. I think that'll work. And I'm just gonna have to put 1 bolt in, I think, because all the standards on this one are all subtly different. Okay, it's not ideal. It's a bit wobbly and it's only held on by 1 bolt. So yeah, hopefully I'll ride really smoothly, because if this gets any kind of serious knock, oh, I think it's going to come unstuck. It's unfortunate. Got high hopes for this. Now we're going to mount the light to the helmet. Now, you should be really careful about this. It's really tempting to use zip ties or really solid mounts, but you need to use either a dedicated mount if one's available, or just be mindful that you want the light to break away in an impact. Why? Well, your helmet's designed to absorb impacts in a certain way, and if you bolt a really large structure to it that's immobile, well, A, you could twang your head on branches, or if you do crash, well, it might impact the strength of the helmet. This Smith helmet's got its own mounting hardware, so we're going to use that, and we're going to use this round bracket that also comes in that mounting hardware to mount the light. Here goes. Okay, that's the light mounted. There's a little bit of adjustment. It's actually not that tight, but apart from shimming it out, there's not that much we can do. Well, we'll go with that. Now we've got to work out where we're going to put the battery pack. The battery's not too heavy, but ideally I don't really want to put it on the helmet, because that's going to adjust and change the center of gravity. It's also quite high already, so even on my head, even as secure as the helmet is, it feels a bit wallaby and sort of odd. Okay, right. Thankfully, this Camelback has got some nice pockets just here. I mean, the pocket is in a perfect place. It's less than ideal with this cabling. Maybe I'll be able to run it underneath. No, there's no space. Can run it. Yeah. I guess I can run it under here to keep it from rattling too much. There we go. That'll do for now, I think. Right. That's the entry-level lights fitted. Okay, for the hangover headlamp, it's an action cam mount, so that works really well with this Smith helmet. So I've just got to plug that in the right way round. Yep. Thread that through there. And as it's all one-piece design, it should just plug in. And then I'll be able to adjust it a little bit on the fly. Tighten up a little bit more. Right, that was quite simple, wasn't it? Okay, we've got the clamp set up here, which is nice and adjustable. And we've got the bar clamp, so we can run it in a couple of different configurations. I think we'll try it this way. So it's a split design, so it should be nice and easy to mount. But essentially we've got a wing nut here to adjust the angle, and then we can just sort of adjust the height of where the light is and make sure it's not being sort of attacked by any leads. But it's very simple. The Asia Pacific region is a global leader in semiconductors. They make some of the highest quality electronic consumer goods on the planet. So it's no surprise that some of the brands that we see on these portal websites are brands that we've not heard of in the US or in Europe. Are all the brands up and coming, big brands, big players to be? Some of them probably are, but some of them aren't. What do I mean? Well, some of them that we saw were really inspired by designs of other big brands of lighting. And inspired is fine. Copying is not. Counterfeiting is definitely not. Officially, all of these portals don't do that. They don't take other people's intellectual property and regurgitate it. But you do have to be really careful on these portals, because sometimes the picture looks really good and what you get delivered is very different. So make sure you take care when you're buying from these portals, because sometimes it's not as good as it looks. The big brands have really helped develop both the LED technologies and the batteries that we've got now, making them really consistent and cohesive as a package, which I guess is one reason why it's been really popular to have a head torch and a bar mounted one, is these big brands invested in the technology to have these smaller slimline designs. And that's another thing actually, is that they work really hard on making sure that the lights are easy to set up and easy to mount. Yes, that costs time and it does cost money. I guess the other thing is that they're moving away from this race of just bigger lumens and bigger numbers, because it's not just about a bigger number. Well, you might think it is, but it's not. And I'll tell you why. Beam pan, that's why. So how those LEDs use those potential lumens make a really big difference. And that's where the big brands really spend the money and spend the time researching and development. I think the other area where lots of the brands, be exposure or glowworm or outbound lighting, do really good work is warranty. I know you might not want them to do any work on warranty because the product should be good enough, but lots of these brands have really good warranties where if you're buying any electronic component, you'd want that. But especially one where, especially in the UK, you're going to have lots of time on the light, in the wet, the cold, maybe even the snow. And if it fails, well, it might not just be just a crap short ride, it's going to be a long walk in the dark home. Okay, right, now we're on the factory to consumer portal lights. Immediately, I've got a really strong sort of spotlight on my headlamp, but it's a really round sort of small spot lamp. It's a real small spot. Let me sort of demonstrate. There you go. So there's a really small ball, small circle of light in the centre, and then there's not a lot of fall off. So it's really harsh around the edge. So it's hard to sort of gauge distance on it. Okay, so that's my most powerful setting, I think. It's a good spot, but it's that beam pattern. So the peripheral sort of throw of the handlebar light is good. It's a really quite broad beam, to be fair, but there's not a lot of throw in the middle. You'd think this combination would sort of work quite a lot better together, but again, they've not really been designed to work better. Oh, I think we just had a bit of pivoting there from the bracket. The bracket is a bit of a distraction, I must admit, as is the cable. This top headlamp was 2000 lumens, and this bar mount here is meant to be 10,000, but because that beam pattern is just a bit all over the place, it's just not as rideable. Oh, there's something definitely rattling. Crap. Well, that's not good, is it? Well, it's still on. That helps. Well. Oh dear. Okay, great example just there. Quite a quick corner where I needed to look further ahead than the bar light was doing. So the bar light gives me this wonderful deep long pull that's really wide, and then this headlamp is actually a spot, so it gives me just that extra long distance depth perception. The other thing that we need to talk about is also the colour. The light temperature is going to be different, so it can be brighter and whiter, or bluer and colder, or warmer. And all of these different factors mean that the light works in different ways and works on your eyes in different ways. So there's a lot going on in light, and it's not just a number. On the trail, it wasn't a numbers game, and it was really interesting. On paper, these lights should have been fantastic. They've got loads more lumens. This one, well, depending on which number you looked at, was either 5,000 or 10,000, so that's at least double the other lights. But the other light's beam pattern was much better. How it used its light on the trail was much better. It was easier to ride faster with that light. And that's not thinking about how the clamp worked and how easy it was to set up. And it's not thinking about the peace of mind that you get from a real company that is going to back you up with spares, and you're not going to have to worry about things catching on fire, which batteries in these units are really packed with energy and fires can happen. This lamp on my head got really hot. Maybe that was me not going fast enough. Maybe on a commute it would be okay. I think the other thing that sort of gave me peace of mind was that The other lamps, they just worked. It's quite a seamless experience. With this one, well, the clamp didn't really work and it's already really rattly and I haven't knocked it. I think the other thing that scared me is that I could see light shining through the end caps here, which made me think that it's really not waterproof. So maybe for very casual use, it could work really well. But I think for proper mountain biking, out on the trails, out in the middle of nowhere where you need reliability, I think it's worth investing in the more expensive lights. For me, that night ride experience really reignited the ride experience. I'm really looking forward to heading out every night.
Me and Doddy have recently been debating the difference between old school and mid school. Mid school being that sweet spot between retro and modern. I'm thinking late 2000s, early 2010s. But it got me thinking, has there really been enough change in the last decade, in the last 10 or so years, for us to classify that whole entire era with its own category? Well, I'm going to take you back in time and find out for myself. Whoa, what the heck am I wearing so much white for an off-road trail ride? Shimano DXs, pretty cool, but seriously heavy. And who stole my socks? Why are they so short? Backpack, Camelback, of course, for all the sandwiches on my bike ride, and 2 litres of water. Obviously, 2 bottles isn't enough. Yeah, so 2010s. I think it was a time when in downhill, Greg Minnaar and G Atherton reigned supreme. Julian Absalon was on his winning streak in the cross-country World Cup. And when it come to bikes, there was cross-country, there was downhill. Enduro didn't really exist as a bike category. We had all mountain, and that was everything from trail to free ride, apparently. And this is one of those bikes. So this is my GT Aggressor circa 2010, maybe 2009. And you know what? The tech wasn't so bad back then. We've got disc brakes instead of V brakes. We've still got triple chain rings here, but this is a 3x9. Aluminium is reasonably lightweight. We've got some decent forks up the front here with the Marzocchi bombers. You know, things aren't that bad. But hey, let's dive into some deeper detail about the components and the geometry to see how things have really changed over the last decade. Yeah, that old bit of tack can stay in the 2010s for all I care, because we've got it so good right now. Even if we look at an aluminium hardtail for trail, things have really changed in the last 10 years. Geometry, components, suspension is amazing. Wheel sizes and widths have changed for the better, in my opinion. And I'm going to dive into each of those in more detail now to show you how it's really changed. And don't forget to subscribe if you want more content like this in the future. Now, mid-school bikes were all about those 26s, and apparently coloured rims as well. But 29er was present in the 2010s, but they were more a kind of genre of their own for people who wanted to roll over roots and rocks, as if 26s weren't capable of doing that. But 2017 was when we started to see 29ers becoming more commonplace, even in the world of cross country. Now I've got 27.5 here, and this is considered a more playful size, I would say, but 29er is more common in your trail bikes these days. Also, I'm running 2.2 inches on the GT Aggressor over here, pretty commonplace back then. But I don't think a modern trail bike would start on anything less than 2.4 inches these days. I'm actually running 2.6s at the higher end of the tyre width. And as a result, our wheel rims have become much wider to accommodate more tyre widths as well. Back in the mid-century, we seemed to measure our suspension in inches rather than millimetres, which we do now. I've got a whopping 5 inches of travel on my Marzocchi bombers here, which was actually 130 mil-ish. Now 130 mil is pretty good for trail these days, so I wouldn't say suspension length has changed that much. However, it's not unsurprising to see 160 or even 170 on a trail bike these days, even if you're not doing super aggressive enduro downhilly riding. I would say that obviously technology has changed quite a bit in suspension. Damping technology has really progressed in the last 10 years, and it makes the old bombers, sorry to say, feel a little bit like pogo sticks, I've got to say. But just that small upgrade in technology, in the dampers, for example, of a set of forks from 10 years ago versus now, means that our riding style has completely changed. This bike feels more like a cross-country bike for bridleways nowadays, compared to this bike, which is still an aluminium hardtail, but Blake has ridden this bike in the Mega Avalanche. I mean, that is downhill territory. So suspension has brought our riding along as well. So aggressor by name, aggressor by nature. Back in the day, this bike was considered an aggressive trail bike. It was considered a bit racy, and it was described as long and roomy. Now, this is a medium bike, and my Scout is a small. And yet, that is a couple of mil longer in the chainstay, 29 millimeters longer in the top tube. The overall wheelbase is 108 mils longer than this medium trail bike from the 2010s. You know, we talk a lot about bikes getting longer, slacker and lower these days, and we moan, I guess, about the small changes. But when you look over the space of a decade, those are big changes. They have definitely got longer. And we've even got a 55 millimeter extra standover clearance. Look how much lower this top tube is to this. And for me, I hate to use the word game changer, but that really has been the game changer. Being able to step down easily with confidence, having a bike long enough and roomy enough to tackle technical terrain means that this has really brought on my riding, and I think our riding as a whole, over the last decade. Now, I know I'm comparing two different brands here, but the GT Aggressor had a 71-degree head angle, which I would say is pretty commonplace for cross-country trail bike back in the day. And the Nuke-Proof Scout has a 65-degree head angle. A little aggressive, but not out of the ordinary. That's a 6-degree difference. I mean, I think 2010s me would look at this bike and think it was a downhill hardtail. But interestingly, the seat tube angle has actually got steeper. So this is 1 degree steeper on the Nuke-Proof Scout. And I think those angles in both the seat tube and the head tube angle is indicative of our style of riding and what we want to do in our trail riding these days. I think trail riding has fast become more of a winch and plummet style of riding, which means you need a steep seat angle to winch up those steep fire roads, and then you need a slack head angle so that you can tackle more aggressive, steeper technical descents, more so than what I was probably doing in the 2010s, which is probably a bit more like cross-country marathon these days. One of the biggest differences between the mid-school and the new school, I think it's got to be the dropper post, has it not? I mean, sure, the dropper post was in development around about this time. The RockShox Reverb was dropped in 2010. It was one of the first hydraulic sealed units with a remote action. But they really weren't commonplace. Even if you'd bought a GT Force, which was the full suspension version of this trial bike, you still would have got a rigid post. And it was very commonplace to come to the top of a hill and manually drop your post before you did some gnarly descending. And gone are those days, thanks to the dropper post. You can now drop it mid-ride, barely without thinking about it. And I think then people will hail this as one of those game changer components. And obviously gearing has massively changed. We've got a whopping 27 gears over here, thanks to 3 chain rings at the front and 9 cogs in the rear cassette. We have a whopping 44 teeth up the front. Here is our biggest one. And in the rear it's 32, so it's almost switched around, as I often rock a 32 on the front and I'll go up to even 52 in the rear on my cassette at the back. The big difference though, I would say, is although you had more gears back then, the range was actually a lot lower. And if you took away all of the crossover, so for example, you won't want to run your biggest chainring up front and your biggest cog at the back because that's too much stress on the chain. And once you start listing out the different gear ratios that you have between the combinations of 3 at the front and 9 at the back, there were so many crossovers and so many similarities that a 27 or a 21 speed would actually usably come down to about a 13 or a 12 speed. So these days we have it pretty good. We have similar gear ratio, a bigger range, on all of that without the front derailleur, which I've got to say, I am happy to leave in the past. Don't you just love front derailleurs? Why am I glad to leave this? Well, not only is it extra weight and extra maintenance, these things are a nightmare to adjust. And I swear you'd press a button and often nothing would happen. And then check out the lack of clutch in this rear derailleur. That chain would bounce around on a descent and pretty much change gear for you. And you know what? Don't even get me started on how many levers you have on your bars and how skinny those handlebars are as well. And why is that stem so long? So does this bike deserve its own category in the mid-school? Yeah, I think it does. It's not retro, but it's certainly not modern. And things really have changed a lot in 10 years. Now, Enduro wasn't technically a bike category back in the 2010s. It did sort of exist. Enduro racing was starting somewhere in Italy, but it wasn't until the mid 2010s that we were starting to see Enduro world racing and grassroots Enduro in our own countries. But it was Mountain of Hell and Mega Avalanche that was kicking off around about the 2010s that really started getting that endurance downhill category going. And I think our love for that and our excitement about this new genre is what really changed trail bikes. Trail and enduro started to blur a little bit, and development in suspension and things like dropper posts really changed the game for normal riders like us. And frankly, I'm grateful. I think modern day bikes are absolutely amazing, and I wouldn't change it for the world. I think this bike can stay in the mid-school, in the 2010s, where it belongs.
Welcome to 2005. Welcome to Lavinio. Welcome to Rachel Atherton's World Champs winning bike. This is the Giant DH Team. It's a burly aluminium frame. It's got a single pivot with a link activated shock. It's not the most advanced bikes compared to now, but then it was cutting edge. It's got a Boxer World Cup Air, which at the time is really cutting edge, but it is quite steep and quite high by modern standards. Cutting edge fork for 2005. This is the Boxer World Cup. This is the Air edition. Rachel telling us that this was really light feeling, so much lighter than the coil fork. By modern standards, it's, well, really quite skinny and really quite narrow, and yeah, it's a bit weak. So we've said it's steep, we've said it's quite short. The other thing that is staggering about this bike is how, well, long the stem is and how narrow the bars are. We measured them and they're almost 650. You couldn't buy a bike these days, cross country or enduro, with a bar that narrow. At the back of the bike, it's still kind of older. So there's some innovations though. We've got this fantastic SRAM racing development. So this is pre-black box technology. I mean, the technology is a non-clutched rear mech, so it's not that exciting. It is 10-speed though, so that's quite good. Wheels, as you may have noticed, are quite little. These are only 26-inch, and the tyres are only 235. Again, that's cross-country size, and this was the gold medal winning World Champ bike. Rotor's fairly big. The disc brake is only a 2-pot. Again, something you'd see on a cross-country bike these days. We've been in the time machine back to 2005 for this gold medal winning bike. Now, what happened in 2023? It's 2023, we're in Fort William. Charlie Hatton has just won his home world champs on this bike. This bike being the Atherton's AM200. It's incredible. We've got 3D printed lugs, we've got carbon tubes, all mated together and positioned around this DW6 6-bar linkage. So it might look like it's got a horse link and it's just a 4-bar, but it's not. There's an extra set of links just down in here. It's really clever, really tunable too. Compared to the 05 bike, we've got a humongous DHX2 Fox shock. I mean, the stroke is probably twice the length of the shock we had on the 05 bike, and the coil is, well, it's just huge. Lots more damping adjustment as well, lots more control. Up front, we've also gone supersized. We've got the Fox 40, and I think the diameter of the stanchion is at least 15mm bigger. It's still an air fork though, so that's the same. Up front, this is a very different beast from the Giant. This tyre is huge. It's a 2.5. It's really big, much bigger than the 2.35 that we saw on the Giant. The other thing that's kind of big as well is the wheel. It's a 29er up front, but it's not just up front that's bigger. The back is actually bigger too. It's a 650B or 275 on the rear. Again, matched with a 2.5 tyre. Really big, chunky tyres for loads of grip. It's not only the tyres and wheels that have gone supersized in the kind of time gap between bikes, it's also that front rotor. Look at the size of it. I think it's a 220. It's huge. Lots of braking performance. We've also gone from a 2-pot brake, where we've just got 2 opposing pistons, to a 4-pot, double the number of pistons. I'm sure the pad size is much, much bigger, so lots more stopping power. So continuing the conversation about the front of the bike, we've got a littler stem and it's direct mount, so that's nice. But the big thing is the bars. Opposed to those like 660 bars that are on the Giant, these are 760. That's like 100 mil bigger, 10 centimeters bigger. It's a lot more width and a lot more leverage. So at the back of the bike, okay, we've still got a derailleur, but things have moved radically. So they're running a 7-speed rear mech, so down from the 10-speed that we got on the Giant, but actually we've got 9 cogs. Now that's a bit tricky. It's an old school trick whereby you don't run the whole number of gears that you've got on the cassette, but it means you can space the cassette perfectly for the chain line of the bike. So it means you're going to operate just right in all the gears. And speaking of drivetrain, we've got an O-chain on the front. So this is a clever system which helps eliminate kind of the feedback or pedal feedback through the suspension by allowing the cranks just to move a little bit under load. So it's not so much under load, it's more through kickback and feedback through the drivetrain. It's a very, very clever setup and light years ahead of the 05 Giant. Okay, we've seen the 05 bike, we've traveled in the time machine to 2023. Let's go and meet one of the founders of this bike brand. Let's go meet Rachel Atherton. We're here with Downhill World Cup GOAT. That sounds like I'm being mean, but greatest of all time. Just, you know, a bit of hype for the intro.
One off.
No, not one off. And we're doing then and now. So we've got your first World Champs bike, so 2005, a little while ago. And then we've got like the newest equivalent of your Atherton's bike behind you, which, okay, it's not yours, but yours is very similar to it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, talk us briefly through like the difference in terms of like how you're riding, where you're riding, and the kind of like performance of the newer wheels, and just very briefly.
Well, when you look at it, it's crazy because it's, you know, obviously it actually does feel like a long time ago. 2005, is it? Or
yeah, 2005, yeah.
So it's a junior world champ, so, you know.
Well, it still counts though.
Still counts, yeah. And at the time, it was obviously cutting edge, and I remember it was the first, I think it was I don't know if it was the first race I got the air boxes, but they came out that year.
Okay, yeah. Which would have been like first air downhill fork, I guess.
Yeah, and they were so light. You'd be like, I remember riding, being like, oh my gosh, I can jump way easier.
Okay, yeah.
Obviously couldn't, because I wasn't very good at it, but it's mad it's been hung up in the office for years. So seeing it down and just how small it is and the head angle's so steep.
Yep.
It's so dangerous. You know, the bikes back then were so dangerous compared to they are now. The twitchy and small wheels, it's just mad to think that you could even ride down anything on it. I wouldn't be able to ride it down now.
Yeah.
Probably as good as you did back then.
Because it shows how skillful you were to get world champs on it,
I don't know.
on a bike that wasn't
No, but
so
at the
good.
time, it was, you know, everyone was on the similar bikes.
Yeah.
So it's sort of, it's just part of that era, and you don't think, you know, everything develops. And now we're kind of at the other end of the scale, and you think...
So this is stock, and then you've got Charlie's bike behind you, which is only a few centimetres off your build spec as well in terms of the geometry. So, I mean, how good is it to have that ability to have a custom-sized bike?
Oh, I mean, yeah, you know, that's probably part of the reason why the field and everyone's got so much faster, and, you know, having the bike fitting you right. And I'm probably not far off the same height I was back then, you know, and it's just kind of, it's that twitchiness, the stability, you know, you can just go so much faster on a bike that fits you right.
Yeah.
You can just hit things and be more aggressive, and obviously everything's come on, the suspension, the brakes, you know, everything, but the sort of suspension platform and the sizing is massive. Versus
just like stock, here you go, that's it.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah. And I guess also like wheel size, so you went full 29 and then you've gone back to sort of like a mixed wheel size.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, well, I say like when we first started Athletic Bikes, it was on a full 29, and I wanted a mullet, but so I'm like ahead of the curve, you know.
Obviously, yeah.
But it takes a while for stuff to filter through, and it's mad to think what they used to do on 26-inch wheels, you know, rampage, everything. It's And when you see a taller rider and a bigger person, you know, I think back to some of G's crashes when he was younger, and some of the stuff that happened to, you know, it's because the bikes are, you know, the steep head angle is just horrendous.
Yeah, we did some measurements outside, and it's got relatively steep head angle. I think it's like 66 or 65, and then the bottom bracket is actually sort of higher than the wheel axles, whereas on, you know, all of the modern bikes we've got, you know, 66 is cross country ish, and then you've got a bottom bracket. Yeah,
but it's almost like a different sport, isn't it? You know, it really is. It's almost like a different, totally different kind of game. You're riding so much quicker. Everything's different, and you know, when these are nothing compared to, you know, what say PT started on. Yeah, those are crazy, those bikes. Yeah, I'm sure he's got quite a few left in his shed. Yeah. But I mean, and the Athletic bike, like we obviously we do a lot of custom sizes, and that's kind of the feedback we get from people, just that extra confidence they get straight away from the bike really kind of fitting them, and then being able to like settle and relax into the size. It's really important.
And I guess this is a brief segue, but I guess how tracks have changed. You've been there through that sort of development of tracks being like, I guess, well, you
don't really notice though. You don't notice, like, I mean, if you went from one to the other really quickly, you definitely would. But I think it's, I definitely more notice you remember the bikes, and when we went to Commensal and we started designing, helping them develop the new bike, and I remember it being a really kind of a different thing because it's so much longer, and the head angle was so slack. You know, I remember it was world champs in Val de Sol, and G and I both ended up winning that in 08, and I remember it was Steve Jones he was just mind blown by the length and how slack they were, and obviously went on to be proved right, and it's those development kind of leaps that people have to take to kind of make things. And then with this, when we first started Athletic Bikes, you get so excited because the changes, it's quite easy to make changes. So I ended up with my bike way too long just because I could. And it was so long, the wheelbase was like the same as Minar's at Enduro World Cup. Right. And I was like, right, it's too long. Couldn't get around any turns. Like, couldn't barely ride it, and turned out the same length as his, and he's way taller than me. So.
Well, I feel Taylor did the same when he was on our brand that you were on as well. Yeah. Because he was on I feel like he was on XL, and I remember he was like really centred, and I remember everyone was a bit head scratching.
And that's the thing. I think everything went a bit mad for a few years. Like when we had that Commensal, and you could change, you know, the wheel length 3 different settings. It's really difficult to change your wheel length, like your wheelbase. between like weekends and track to track, because you know, like we made it longer for Fort William, and then you'd be hitting holes and you'd be hitting things that you wouldn't really hit just because it rides so differently.
Yeah.
And so in a way, it's kind of, you need to settle on a size and just ride it. Too much change and too much kind of, I
guess especially between like
really
a race
good.
weekend where, okay, on TV the track looks really similar, but the subtleties of actually attacking the track is so different, and then you've got to have that, I guess, composure and feel for the bike.
Yeah, and I think of the riders that can get a good setup and then just stick with it, you know, where I was always changing things every weekend, changing everything, and you probably need to find that comfort, and then you just know what the bike's going to do in every situation. So it's a happy medium.
And do you think, to a degree, like not being able to change, like you'd set the bike up for World Cups, I'm trying to think last year when you won, and then you weren't able to change in between races, or were you able to change between races?
What, change like frame and?
Yeah. Or like, were you stuck in it and you're like, oh, actually, I've got to stick with it, and then you were like, oh,
I mean,
not
you've got
just
a certain
podium,
amount
they've won it.
Yeah, you've got a certain amount of kind of sort of room for movement. Even with Trek, you know, we had different rockers and different linkages that would make it like more or less progressive, and I spent the whole season changing them around, and finally found that I actually went back to the standard rocker. We had a much more progressive one, and I struggled all year, and then in Mount St Anne, that was 2015, or no, 2018 it was. Yeah, it was 2018. I'd just come back from injury, really struggled with my setup, and I couldn't just feel confident on the bike, and then changed back to the standard rocker instead of having that more progressive, and I got on so well with it. I won that race, I won the next race, I won World Champs, it was sick. So you kind of, sometimes you take yourself to the extremes of what's possible, and changing things to know what you don't like, and then you go backwards again. So there's no such thing as a sort of the wrong decision, because you're always learning. Yeah,
of course,
Yeah.
And I guess it's all that experience from you, from G, and from Dan as well. I feel like people forget that he's quite quick on a bike too.
Oh, yeah. And he rides all the time. So like, you know, as a racer, you kind of ride and you train and you do rest, and when you don't race anymore, and with the bike park now, like Dan rides so much. He rides more now than he ever did, and then me to a certain extent. So just that being comfortable on the bike and just the little things, you know, with the development of the new bike, it's so good to just have that constant bike time for changing and developing things. You don't have to like specifically go testing because you're always riding. It's really good, yeah.
Okay, so we've done then, we've got now. What about the future? Where's the future for downhill race bikes?
Well, I mean, we're already starting to see it. I think it's that manufacturing process, isn't it? You know, how things are being made. And I think the technology is there and coming quickly, and hopefully it will correlate with the price point, you know, because there's no point in having these incredibly manufactured machines if no one can afford them, and that's kind of where we're trying to push Atherton bikes. You know, the technology's so clever, and it's the future really. You know, the materials, everything's refining, and it's kind of, hopefully the more people do it, like the cheaper it becomes and the more affordable it is, so everyone gets that benefit really to their riding and their enjoyment and to their kind of ride feel, and that's what's important, I think.
So that kind of like race winning pedigree, but for more people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Awesome.
You know, you look at this and it's just so chunky and looks like it's been built by the local builder, and and you look at these sort of crafted machines, and they're only going to get better and improve as the technology, you know, becomes even more available really. So
Exciting times.
Yeah, it is. It really is. Yeah. And there's a few people on the fringes doing it, and you know, pushing the envelope and pushing the kind of, and like that's what excites us here at Atherton Bikes is not doing the run-of-the-mill things. It's trying to figure out like what is next, like what can we do to bring it to more people.
If you suffer the inevitable puncture during a mountain bike ride, or you lose a little bit of pressure from your tyres, there's two ways to get you back inflated, and that is a hand pump or a CO2 inflator. Now there's pros and cons to each, which I'm going to explore today so you can decide which one is best for you. So So this is a CO2 canister, and it's basically full of compressed carbon dioxide, and you can get these in different volumes, and you'll need an inflator which will either push on or screw onto the canister itself and then pierce that canister to release the air. Now, some inflators you will need to pierce and open at the same time as inflating, or something like the PT's hole shot, you can screw on, no air will come out until you push the nozzle onto your valve. It's also a good idea to consider a CO2 cover like this one, because they do get cold, so that just protects your hands. One of the biggest advantages to CO2 inflators is that they're so compact. These will fit in your pocket or strap to small spaces on your frame. You can easily separate the two to make them even smaller so that you can fit them in a bag or take multiple canisters, and you'd be hard pressed finding a hand pump that's as small as a CO2 inflator. I think the main reason that people will buy CO2 inflators is because that they're so quick to use. Something like the PT's hole shot or the Topeak Tubey Boost, they easily inflate an entire tyre with just one press of the inflator, whereas with a hand pump you're going to have to spend time pumping it up. So this is often the racer's choice, as it can be set ready to use, strapped to your bike, and if you get a puncture during a race, you can literally pull that off of your bike and inflate it within a matter of seconds. Even if time isn't of the essence, another pro for the CO2 inflator is that it can seat tubeless tyres. Because there's compressed carbon dioxide in there, they'll come out at a big rush and inflate it really quickly, and this can shock a tyre back onto a rim if the tyre is loose and if it's running tubeless. So this is a handy thing to have if you run tubeless, even if you bring a hand pump out on a trail. The biggest disadvantage, I would say, to a CO2 inflator is that the CO2 cartridges are single use. You can't reuse them, you can't refill them full of air, and if you need to inflate your tyre multiple times on a ride, perhaps you get a second puncture, or perhaps the first one misfired and didn't quite work out, then you're going to need a second one. So you may have to bring multiple CO2 canisters with you, and once they're done, they're done. Whereas a hand pump, you can keep putting air in, it's everlasting, it won't run out. In your CO2 cartridge, the carbon dioxide is actually stored as a compressed liquid, and as it's released as a gas, it causes an endothermic reaction. This is because it needs the energy to convert it to the gas, and it's robbed from the cartridge itself. It actually robs the heat and makes the cartridge freezing cold, and you'll get this frosty appearance on the metal. And when the metal is that cold, you can actually stick your hand to it. So that's why often inflators will come with a cover like this PT's one, or you'll need to be operating that cartridge with a glove. CO2 inflators can be fiddly. Now, this could be due to a compatibility with the valves and the inflator itself. It could just be that you've not put it on properly and you completely misfire and waste a CO2 cartridge. So compatibility can be an issue. And on that word, some tyre sealants, so tubeless sealants, might not be compatible with carbon dioxide. So if you inflate your tyre with a CO2 inflator, then when you get home, you're going to need to release all of that air and put new air in so that it's not carbon dioxide. So a hand pump or a mini pump is exactly what you'd expect. It's a way of inflating a tyre by hand using a pump action. Now, these come in a variety of sizes. As you can see, you can get high pressure or high volume pumps. You can even get pumps with pressure gauges on them like this one, or maybe even a digital pressure gauge instead. And you can often have them as a push on to the valve or as a screw onto the valve. So plenty of options for you to choose what is best for you. The biggest advantage is obviously that a hand pump is multiple use. You could get 50 punches out on the trail and it wouldn't matter because you would always have an endless supply of air, whereas a CO2 will just be one use per canister. So you can help out your friends as well as yourself, and you'll know that you only need to buy this once and you'll be set for life. One of the biggest pros for the hand pump is that you can control the amount of air you put in. So with a CO2 inflator, you're dumping air in there, and without a tyre pressure gauge, you won't know how much you've put in, but also it'll be harder to control the amount that you put in. With a hand pump, if you only want a little bit of pressure, for example, then you can do that. Whereas if you want a lot, you can do that too. And if you have a pressure gauge attached to it, then you can be more specific about getting the right tyre pressure. For all you regular travellers out there, you may find that your airline will restrict you from taking CO2 canisters either completely, or they'll limit the amount that you can take, which means you might have to buy more when you get there, and you may have to leave them in that country when you come back. Whereas the hand pump is safe to fly with, so you can always take that with you no matter what airline or where you're going. One of the biggest disadvantages of a hand pump is even if you buy a mini pump, which is traditionally smaller than a hand pump, it's still going to be a lot bigger than a CO2 cartridge and inflator. It will be harder to put in your pocket, it may be a bit cumbersome in a hip pack, it would be better suited to a backpack, and you'll find it harder to find the space to put this on your bike. But you can get some converters that will allow you to attach it to your bottle cage. Even if you buy a high volume hand pump, these are unlikely to be able to seat a tyre onto the rim if you're running tubeless. Sometimes I have a hard time using a track pump to seat a tyre, which is why CO2 inflators are usually better for that. With the hand pump, it's not going to produce enough volume to shock the tyre onto the rim. However, I will say that as long as you bring a tube with you, you should be able to use a tube and seat it that way. I think the biggest disadvantage to hand pumps is how much time it takes to inflate a tyre, especially from flat. So that'll take a lot of minutes, a lot of effort, which could be a little bit tiresome when it's a cold, wet day, but also it's not one for the racers, as it will create a big time disadvantage in the middle of your race run. Where is that Dodster? It is freezing out here.
Watch out.
What are you doing on those? Are they your summer tyres?
No, these are my mixed terrain tyres.
But I was up all night putting my mud tyres on.
But we're riding mixed terrain.
And it's winter.
Winter tyres are a lie.
We'll see about that.
Nice easy roller to get going.
Easy?
Yeah, nice and easy, eh? Now the tyre I'm running today is called the Enduro. Now this is a trail tyre and it's designed specifically for mixed conditions. Now it sits somewhere in the range above their cross-country tyre, which is called the Barzo, and below the tyre that Anna's using, which is called the Motor. Now when you look at the tread design on this, it's got quite a low stack height, the knobbles are quite close together. What that means when you're climbing is it rolls really quite quickly. None of that energy sapping momentum loss that she's suffering on those big old grippy things.
I know what you're thinking. I'm going to play the weight card here, but I'm not. Actually, I'm running the Vittoria motors here. This is the mud tyre from Vittoria, and I'm running 29 up front, 27.5 at back, same as Doddy. I'm running 2.35 widths. Now, In this setup, the motors are only 150 grams heavier than the Agara that he's running. Now, 150 grams, if you don't know, is about 150 millilitres of water. That's nothing. That's not going to slow you up on a fire road climb. What slows you up is all of these little spikes and these ridges that I'm hitting constantly. Tiny, tiny bits of resistance the whole way up the climb. That's what slows you down. That's the difference between a mud tyre and a mixed terrain tyre. But you know what? I think I'm going to be laughing on the way down. Let's see, shall we?
So, what do you reckon of how much quicker these were on the all-terrain climb?
There weren't much mud on that fire road, was there?
No, but they actually flew along.
Yeah, to be fair, they were pretty draggy, but I feel like I might have the edge here.
Well, we'll
See
see
you
about
later.
that, won't we?
Come on then.
Ah!
Coming. Kind of had the edge a little bit there. Now, you see I've got quite a spiky tread pattern in these mud tyres, and what that does is almost acts like fingers climbing a wall, grabbing on all of the roots and the imperfections in a trail and just hoisting me up. And also these spikes have quite a progressive taper, and that progression allows you to sort of roll over stuff a lot easier, so it's not just a sharp edge. I'll catch him up pretty easily. And also these spikes, because they're quite tall, they will feel quite soft and rubbery and pliable, and that is really grippy when it comes to tech like this. I'll get him, no problem.
Okay, right, let's talk about these tyres then, because they're very different to Anna's tyres. Now, they've both got sipes on them.
Not
which
so
are these
fast now, are we though? Hey.
Right, they've both got sipes on them that you can see on the sidewalls here. But on her tyres, the knobs are so much bigger that it makes a bigger difference. So it makes them stiff in one way and flex in another. It doesn't make too much difference on this stuff here. But there is a little secret weapon with these. Now, on most tyres like this that have got a low profile design, the benefit is they roll really quick. But these ones actually have like a step on that leading edge. So it feels like a ramp when you go nice and quick uphill, but it actually gives you that little bit of edge. And as long as you can manage your pedalling, if you try and stamp on the pedals like Anna's able to do and get through the stuff, you're going to wheel spin. But if you can just spin nice cadence, you've got plenty of grip on these. Actually, surprising amount, I think. It makes it a great mixed condition tyre.
How was that then, Duds?
I'll tell you what, there is a noticeable difference going up there. What I noticed is I could get up everything, but I've definitely got to pay a lot more attention to my lines, where it looked to me that you were like, oh, it doesn't matter, I'm going.
Nah, straight lined everything. Yeah. I didn't even think. There's a lot of swearing coming from behind me though.
it reminds me of the old days, like there wasn't any such thing as a good tyre. You just had to deal with it. And
yeah.
But yeah, it's day and night between them.
What do you fancy next then?
Well, given that that's quite a specific tyre, this is a mixed terrain tyre, I'm going to take you to something that's very mixed in terms of terrain.
All right.
A bit quicker, and I reckon this might have a bit more of an advantage.
Well, we'll find out.
Okay, all right, this will do us. Let's have a little stop here before we drop in. So what I had in mind was, I like my rides to be pretty varied. Like a bit of tech, a bit of flow, a bit of mud, a bit of firm, like literally a bit of everything. So this trail here, basically it's a flow trail. Loads of berms, loads of jumps, all that sort of stuff.
No mud then?
Not really much mud. It's gonna be wet, but it'll be good.
Oh dear.
Nice firm surface.
Go on then.
Not too much support on those turns. Up.
How'd your mud tyres hook up through there then?
Oh yeah, I mean they're a bit draggy, and also like I felt like I was sliding in every corner, whether it's because the spikes were deforming.
Oh, actually sliding on the tyre.
Yeah, or whether it's just less contact patch. I actually felt a bit sketchy on that.
These things are a dream.
Really?
Low stacks, so yeah, just feel predictable. Feel
Well,
great.
should we actually do some proper winter riding then and see how they do?
All right, that's good. Yeah. I'll tell you what, I'm going to give myself a fighting chance, because even on that basic stuff through there, it's not so much there's less grip, I can't even slow down, so they're just scratching on the ground. So I'm going to go old school and just let out a bit of air pressure. It's a fighting way of giving yourself some traction if you've got tyres that are kind of not quite cutting it. Oh my God.
Oh wow.
I literally had zero control of where I was going through there.
Yeah, I mean, there's certain trails that even a mud tyre won't work on, but at least it could afford me some line choice. And look at the clearing on it as well.
Yeah, that's
Basically clean.
Yeah, to be fair, like my tyres were completely bogged up through there, and it was only letting my tyre pressure down, I think, that kept me right upside down.
Yeah, for
Through
sure.
there. But I was all over the place. I couldn't pick a line. I basically just had to survive.
That is the benefit of mud tyres, even when it's not that muddy. But you know what? You were still quick in all of the directions.
Now, it's important to say, although winter for us means moisture and loads of mud, it's very different depending on where you're riding. It could mean snow and ice, or it could mean, if you're lucky enough, nice dusty, sunny conditions.
So I guess what we're saying is there's no such thing as a winter tyre. There's just the right tool for the right job. Depends what you're riding. My mud tyre was brilliant in the mud. It clears, it was braking really well, it had great grip in the technical climbs, but actually it was a bit draggy on the fast rolling stuff and the fire roads.
But don't go out and buy new tyres just off the account of, oh, I'm riding in mud this weekend. Don't forget that whatever you're running is your standard tyres, just like I was running today. You can get the most of them in most conditions if you're happy to accept that you can be a bit out of control here and there. Play with your tyre pressure, it works great. I had a great ride on these tyres today.
Tyres are what connects you and your bike to the ground. A lot of thought has gone into the sight profile, the tread pattern, and even the compound of the tyre to make them perform at their best. But with a decent branded tyre costing around about 60 to 70 English pounds these days, I wondered if you could get similar performance for something that's under £20. So the cheapest mountain bike tyres I could find was actually on Amazon. Now you can see I've had to buy two different brands. Now this is because I run mixed wheel sizes on my Nuke-proof Mega. So I needed to get a 29-inch by 2.4 and a 27.5 by well, similar 2.4 as well. So I had to go with two different brands because they didn't actually make the two different sizes in the same brand. But this has given me a good opportunity to see the difference in quality between the cheaper options anyway. And there's already quite a bit of difference in terms of feel, weight, and actually smell. These smell really bad. And I'll be putting them up against my Vittoria Mazza, which is a enduro trail specific tire. It's what I'm most comfortable on. I run these all the time on my Nukeproof Mega, and I've got obviously a 29 in the front and a 27 in the back, and I usually run 2.4 on both sides. So what I have for the rear here is Baldwin's Baldy's Brown Wall. Yeah, and apparently the tread type is knobbly, excellent all-weather performance and long-lasting durability, although they don't state that they're tubeless specific, so I'm gonna have to run a tube with that. So that's my first negative for the Baldwins. And then over here on the front, my 29er is gonna be the Finchy folding bike tire. That tread type is grooved, apparently. Oh yeah. What we have here is a Finchy downhill tire made of high quality nylon and rubber. Kevlar wire makes this enduro tire foldable and lightweight. Perfect replacement tire for XC bicycles. Also provides fast and comfortable ride on roads and tarmac. This tire does everything, but also this does not state that it's tubeless specific. So to be on the safe side, I'm gonna have to run a tube with that, which again, personally, that is a downside for me. I prefer tubeless. Vittoria, that they'll be going up against the Mazza, and the tread type listed here is for mixed and loose terrain geared towards enduros. So we talked about tread design, and there's a few things about the Mazza that I've grown to love over the time of riding these, and that is that they have this kind of tapered sipe profile. So as they taper in towards the end of the sipe or the knob, then it gives this kind of flexibility, this malleable feel, so that it's soft, which means it'll be nice and grippy. Certainly if you're trying to climb technical climbs, or if you're riding over rougher terrain, it will grab better. But because there's a wider base, you still have that support when you're going into corners. It won't feel like the tire's bending or rolling. If you look over at the Finchy, these are absolutely solid. They do not move. They're quite short as well, which won't help in terms of malleability, certainly won't help in terms of durability either, I think. And even with the Baldies, I would say they're in the opposite direction. They are really, really soft, which is possibly going to be great for grip and tread. But they might feel really disconcerting in the corners. Vittoria Mazza, we have 930 grams for a brand new tire. Baldwin's Baldy's Brown Wall is exactly a kilo, 1,000 grams. Now the Finchy is a 29er, so I will expect it to be a little heavier. It also didn't come in a 2.4 again, which is really annoying. So I've had to go for a 2.6, and that is 1.2 kilos. So the total weight from Vittoria of what I'm running on my Mega is 1,870 grams in total. And for the setup I've got here with the Finchy and the Baldwins will be a total of 2.2 kilograms or 2,200 grams. Now, weight might not be a massive issue for you, especially in enduro, but a lot of that weight on the cheaper tires is coming from the ratio of rubber to nylon threads. So the thread count would be quite low in the cheaper end tires. The Mazzas actually have a thread count of 120 TPI. So TPI is the threads per inch, so how many nylon fibers run through that. And the higher the number, then the more malleable your tire will be, which will offer you great traction, especially on rough terrain, and it will feel a lot grippier. The Finchy here has 60 TPI, at least that's what they've listed it as, which is why it feels quite firm, like a sort of an affordable pair of rubber shoes. Right, first up, let's get acquainted with this trail on the Vittoria Mazzas, seeing as I'm used to these first. Right, let's go. That is soft. Now, there's not many tyres that are going to feel great in ground that's dry. So dry and so soft. Plenty of grip on my rear though. I can literally grind to a stop in those steeps. Right, let's open her up. Wow. Loads of grip in the corners. Gotta love the Mazzas. Woo! Went off track there, that was my fault. Jumps, grips well on the loose stuff afterwards. There you go. Easy, loads of grip. Could be that those rocks are grippy, but I'm thinking it's probably the Vittorias are helping. No bending or distorting, as you would expect from a company that put a lot of money into R&D. That trail's pretty wild in places. There's like rocks and sand and corners and natural drop-offs. It's pretty unpredictable in places, but I think that is the perfect trail to put a tyre through its paces. So let's try the other Amazon set of tyres now. That went on very easy indeed. 19.5, perfect. So I've just taken my front tyre off and there is an absolutely massive splinter of wood through my tyre. No joke, I wouldn't have seen that. And obviously the sealant has sealed it, which is absolutely why I prefer tubeless tyres and sealant. If there was a tube in there, there's no way that would have stayed afloat and I would have got a very, very flat front tyre. God, these are so stiff and thick. Right, time to try the Amazon tyres, and obviously the big difference already is that the rear wheel looks so skinny and the front wheel looks so fat. And you may be thinking it's not a completely fair test, but I do think it's important to note that when you buy cheap tyres, you do get less choice on things like width. So anyway, enough talk. Let's see what they feel like. Already a bit slidey in the rear. Nice volume in the front. 2.6 is obviously quite comfy. Oh, bit skatey though. Oh, ah! Neither of them like the loose terrain. Oh, nearly lost the front wheel on that. Oh. Right, I've had to have a little pause because I had a little moment there where I was coming round a corner and I'm so concerned with the potential lack of grip washing out over the corner. What I didn't realise is that weighting the bike and having not much grip or sipes on the edges means the bike actually dragged inside and nearly threw me over the outside of the corner. So just to cut it short, I'm actually really noticing the lack of tread on the front. It's very washy and the back end is quite skatey, which isn't too bad. It makes me feel pretty cool in the corners, but I wouldn't say it was very fast or very safe. I certainly wouldn't want to race in these. Anyway, let's carry on. Oh my days, this is skating. a straight line, they're okay. Their front tyre slipped down the rock. That was an interesting run. They're not terrible, but not amazing either. So let's go and have a little sit down and talk about the differences. Baldwin's Baldy's brown wool at the rear here. Now, first thing to mention is they absolutely stink. They smell like an old ashtray, which is just disgusting. And fitting them was almost a little too easy, in my opinion. They felt slightly baggy, and the recommended 30 to 55 PSI is not what I would like to run for an off-road trail tyre, certainly not enduro. I'd like to run a little less. Because they were quite thin carcass, the lack of support when going over rough ground, over rocks and over roots, I actually hit my rim. And again. For me, I would like more support and definitely tubeless for a rear. I'd also like to point out that the lack of tread on the sides of the carcass meant that the rear tyre washed out sideways quite a lot. Pretty much every loose corner it would wash out. But I think this is probably best left to tamer trails if you're going to run something like this, and you've got to be happy running tubes at quite a high pressure. So the Finchy folding tyre on the front, you know what? I really enjoyed having a 2.6. You know, the volume is nice to have, especially here in Spain where it's really rocky and rough. But when I fitted these, the pressure was a bit better than the rear. We were allowed to run a recommended 25 to 55 PSI, which is a bit better in my realms. However, the carcass was so thick and so firm that even in a low pressure, this felt like they were rock solid, which made them actually feel quite fast rolling, I must admit. They were good in the flatter trails, I would say, but the lack of tread on the center was a bit disconcerting. So although they looked like they had good side grip because of the sipes around the sides of the carcass, the lack of tread in the center meant my front wheel washed quite a lot, especially when steering around loose, tight corners. And for me, that is just a no. For enduro, certainly. So steep, loose trails, and when you're riding proper enduro, I just don't think a cheap tyre with lack of support is very fun. You know, it's not fun to face plant. I quite like my teeth, so that's sort of a big no-no for me. Also, the tubeless element, I think, you know, I got away with it on the big volume here. It was a nice amount of support, even though it was tubed. So overall, like I said, they're not terrible. I think if I had a cross-country bike or a trail bike where I was doing nice kind of mellow trails and nothing was requiring me to hit the brakes or come in too fast into corners, they would be fine. They're fast rolling, and you know what? They were quite okay. But if you're going to ride genuine enduro trails, steep, loose terrain, rough terrain, then I do think it is worth purchasing a decent set of tyres. Not only will they offer you support in corners, they'll offer you more grip and traction in loose terrain, but also your brakes will work a lot better if your tyres can actually dig into the terrain. Many of you viewers tell me you haven't moved on to 12-speed and you don't need it. And then Nukeproof sent me a brand new Scout with Shimano Dior 10-speed on it. And it got me thinking, is 10-speed so bad? Do we really need 12 gears? SRAM brought out the Eagle drivetrain back in 2016, and they promptly declared the death of the front derailleur because it offered 500% gear range, which was comparable to most 2x systems at the time. Then Shimano brought out their microspline freehub bodies, which allowed you to put a tiny 10-tooth cog on the cassette, and that gave you 510% range. And then SRAM came back out with this, the 10 to 52 tooth cassette, which offered you 520% gear range. And more is better, isn't it? Well, let's dive a little deeper into that. So to work out the gear range of your cassette, you need to take the biggest gear, which is a 52 on here, divide it by the smallest gear, which is a 10, and then times it by 100 to represent it as a percentage. So for this, it's 520%. Now on my 10-speed over here, I've got a 48 tooth, divide that by the 11 and times it by 100, that gives me 436%. Well, that sounds rubbish in comparison to this, right? Well, I mean, that percentage doesn't really tell us anything about what's going on between the biggest and the smallest ring. It doesn't tell us how many gears we've got, and it doesn't tell us about the increments in which you have to get to those higher gears. So I think what we've become used to is seeing that bigger percentage and thinking, well, that bigger percentage means we get that easier gear. But if the easier gear is all we care about, well, that means we should be talking about gear ratios. So let's dive into what that really means. Gear ratios are ratios because they take into account the second cog and show the relationship between the two. So if you were in a 30 tooth at the front and a 10 tooth at the back, then you have a 30 to 10 gear ratio. So as the 10 is 3 times smaller than the 30, we know that that little cog at the rear will rotate 3 times in the time it takes to make 1 pedal revolution at the front. So as the cogs turn the back at the rear wheel, we know that the smaller cogs on the back cover more distance, but they will feel harder. Bigger cogs will take longer to rotate with 1 pedal revolution, so we know they cover less distance, but they also feel easier. But we can also turn these gear ratios into decimals. So a 30 divided by 10 is 3, meaning the cog will turn 3 times with 1 pedal revolution, and 3 is quite high for a gear ratio. 1 or lower is a nicer climbing gear, obviously depending on how powerful you are or how heavy your bike is, but it gives you good cadence. If we were to plot all of these decimals onto a table, we can quickly look over the crossovers. So we can see that a 30 tooth front chainring with a whopping 52 tooth at the back achieves the same gear ratio as a 28 tooth at the front with a 48 tooth at the back. This means it will travel the same distance and it will feel the same easiness as that fancy 12-speed Eagle's easiest gear. So gear ratios tell me that I can match this nice, easy Eagle gear here, and all I have to do is swap this cassette from a 46 tooth to a 48 tooth cassette, and I need to swap my front chainring from a 30 to a 28. The problem is that Shimano don't actually make 28 tooth chainrings anymore, and they're really hard to find, and they won't actually fit on a Shimano crank set either, so I would have to find some alternative cranks. And well, I've kind of gone halfway to replacing the entire drivetrain at this stage by doing that. Now there is actually a third cog in this scenario, and that is your wheel. So if you were to have a smaller wheel, you would cover less distance, but as we know already, that feels easier. So you could make it slightly easier with smaller wheels, and maybe that's why you retro nerds out there love the 10-speed still, especially if you're on 26-inch wheels. But that also explains why we needed the SRAM Eagle drivetrain in the first place, because we're all now obsessed with the bigger wheels, like the 29er. And now, if you want to get super nerdy, now you can go to Sheldon Brown's gear calculator. I'll leave the link on the screen, and that will allow you to start working out those 2 gears and the wheel size, and it even takes into account the crank lengths as well. Now, there's actually a bigger problem here than just the availability of small chain rings. If you had a chain ring that is too small, your chain might actually rub on the frame, because bikes these days are optimized for bigger front chain rings. In fact, if you have a full suspension bike, a smaller chain ring might actually affect the performance of your rear suspension. Huh? So when we see these anti-squat numbers, it will be with a particular gearing in mind, because chain ring size will affect the anti-squat. A larger front chain ring may be more resistant to suspension compression when pedaling, which makes them more efficient climbers, but this can lead to a firmer suspension feel. Small chain rings have a less taut chain, effectively, so less chance of pedal kickback for sure, and a nice active rear suspension feel, but too much and it'll just bob under pedaling up the climbs. Ugh, my head hurts. Should we just wrap this up and get to the conclusion? As I've explained, with a 10-speed drivetrain, you get those 10 gears somewhere in the middle of a 12-speed cassette, which means that you lose out on that easy gear for climbing up hills, and you miss out on that bottom gear that's nice and fast and efficient. But if that's not a problem to you, then you will afford a drivetrain that's almost half the cost of a 12-speed drivetrain. In fact, if we look at this cassette alone, a Shimano Dior 10-speed cassette costs around about £35 here in the UK, and a Shimano Dior 12-speed costs around about £95. So even replacing parts will be a lot more affordable. So if you don't need the easier gear and you don't need the harder gear, then no, you don't need 12-speed. But 12-speed does afford us some better gear range. So we can go from hill spin to fire road sprint in just one cassette, which is great. And we certainly do need some slightly easier gears now that we're moving up into bigger wheel sizes. But I want to know what you guys think. Do you think we need 12 speed? Are you still on 10 or 11 speed? And are you happy? And why do you think that is? Let me know down in the comments below, and we'll start up that debate for our future GMBN Tech community to join in with.